The day started like any other, or so I thought. It was early September, just after Labor Day weekend, and the forest was starting to settle down from the summer rush. I'm a park ranger in a large national forest somewhere in the Northern Rockies. I've been here for years now, doing backcountry patrols, trail maintenance, and everything in between. The work is tough, but I like it. I like the quiet. I like being alone out in the woods where the only sounds are birds, wind in the trees, and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. That morning, I packed up my gear for a solo overnight patrol in a remote section of the park, one that sees little traffic this time of year. The trailhead sits at the edge of a small gravel road that dead ends into a washout from last winter's heavy snowmelt. The forest there is dense, mostly Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and patches of thick underbrush. The trail itself is narrow, and over the years, it's been slowly growing back in places. I needed to check some boundary markers and look for any signs of illegal hunting or camping. I carry my standard pack: water, some MREs, a first aid kit, my handheld radio, map, compass, and a lightweight tent. I always bring my sidearm for protection, not because I expect trouble from people, but because of bears and mountain lions. These animals mostly avoid humans, but you never know. The day was clear, a bright blue sky with a few scattered clouds. I set out mid-morning, taking my time on the trail. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a fresh smell after recent rain a couple of days prior. The forest was alive, birds calling, chipmunks rustling in the leaf litter, and the occasional woodpecker knocking on a tree trunk. I passed a small creek, its water cold and clear. I stopped for a moment, crouched by the bank, and drank directly from it. The water tasted crisp and clean. I kept an eye out for any signs of recent human activity: broken branches, discarded trash, or fresh footprints. But the trail was quiet. Aside from my own footprints, no one had been here for days. By late afternoon, I reached the boundary markers. They were still in place, weathered but readable. I took some notes and photos for the park's records. I knew I'd have to come back in a few weeks to check on the trail again, but for now, all seemed normal. I found a small clearing a little off the trail, perfect for setting up camp for the night. It had a flat, dry patch of ground surrounded by firs. The smell of pine needles was strong here, and the soft moss on the ground made for a decent bed. I set up my tent quickly, knowing the sun would be down in a couple of hours. After dinner, I cleaned up, packed away my trash, and sat outside the tent to enjoy the fading light. The forest was growing darker, shadows stretching long between the trees. The temperature was dropping fast, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger with the evening chill. As darkness fell, I turned on my headlamp to do a quick perimeter check. I scanned the trees for any movement. In this part of the forest, it wasn't unusual to see deer or elk come out at dusk, but I didn't see any that night. The silence was thick, the kind that feels like the whole world is holding its breath. I crawled in my tent, zipped it up tight, and settled in for the night. My radio was on, tuned to the Ranger channel, but I didn't expect any calls. The usual chatter had died down by now. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a small animal moving through the underbrush. I sat up quietly, listening. The sound was soft but steady, something scraping against bark. It didn't sound like a deer or a small critter. It was deeper, heavier, like a large animal moving slowly, brushing against trees. I reached for my flashlight and peeked outside the tent. The beam cut through the dark, catching the rough shapes of trees and bushes. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I caught a shadow moving, large, slow, deliberate. My heart started to beat faster, but I stayed calm. I knew bears lived in this forest, and a big male could easily stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder. I pulled out my sidearm, a precaution more than anything. The sound continued, low grunts mixed with the scraping of hooves or paws against bark. I grabbed my radio and keyed it. "Base, this is Ranger Hollow. I'm hearing something moving outside my camp. Looks like a large animal, maybe a bear. Requesting a status check." No reply. The radio crackled with static, then silence. I tried again a few times. Still nothing. The batteries in the radio were full this afternoon, but maybe the range was limited here. The noises grew louder. The scraping turned into snapping branches, heavy footfalls pressing into the soft earth. I could hear the animal moving closer to my campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I remember my training: don't run, don't make sudden movements. Stay calm and wait for it to pass. I kept the flashlight steady and the sidearm ready. The sounds came right to the edge of the clearing, paused, then moved along the far side of the trees. For nearly an hour, the animal prowled around the clearing, circling slowly. I caught glimpses of dark fur between the tree trunks, the glint of eyes reflecting the flashlight. I could smell it too, a strong, musky scent of wild animal. I stayed awake the whole time, listening, waiting. The animal never tried to come into the clearing directly, but it was close enough to keep me on edge. Eventually, the noises faded and the forest grew quiet again. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was cool and damp. I looked around carefully. There were fresh tracks in the soft dirt, huge paw prints, easily twice the size of a large dog's. The prints circled my campsite multiple times. The ground was disturbed where the animal had scratched at tree bark, looking for insects or marking territory. There was no sign of any other animals or humans nearby, just my camp and the forest. I packed up slowly, making sure to leave no trace. The adrenaline was still in my veins from the night, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The area was wild and dangerous, and this bear, or whatever it was, had made it clear that it claimed this place. On the way back down the trail, I stopped at the creek again and filled my water bottle. I looked back toward the clearing one last time. The forest seemed peaceful in the morning light, but I knew the truth. Out here, in the quiet, the wild still ruled. The animals were patient and strong, watching and waiting. Back at the ranger station, I wrote up my report, noting the large animal tracks and the night's encounter. I requested a patrol team to check the area during the day and install some wildlife cameras to monitor the animals' movements. The next few days were busy. Rangers came out, set up cameras, and scouted the area. The footage confirmed a large male grizzly bear had taken up residence nearby. Signs of feeding on fallen logs, fresh digs, and claw marks on trees showed this was a bear in prime health, fully aware of its territory. I learned something important that week. No matter how familiar you think you are with the wilderness, it can still surprise you. You have to respect the animals, respect their space, and never underestimate the power of nature. That night alone in the backcountry reminded me that the forest doesn't belong to me or any human. It belongs to those who live quietly in the shadows. And sometimes, those shadows come close enough to remind you who's really in charge. The day started like any other, or so I thought. It was early September, just after Labor Day weekend, and the forest was starting to settle down from the summer rush. I'm a park ranger in a large national forest somewhere in the Northern Rockies. I've been here for years now, doing backcountry patrols, trail maintenance, and everything in between. The work is tough, but I like it. I like the quiet. I like being alone out in the woods where the only sounds are birds, wind in the trees, and the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt trail. That morning, I packed up my gear for a solo overnight patrol in a remote section of the park, one that sees little traffic this time of year. The trailhead sits at the edge of a small gravel road that dead ends into a washout from last winter's heavy snowmelt. The forest there is dense, mostly Douglas fir, lodgepole pine, and patches of thick underbrush. The trail itself is narrow, and over the years it's been slowly growing back in places. I needed to check some boundary markers and look for any signs of illegal hunting or camping. I carried my standard pack: water, some MREs, a first aid kit, my handheld radio, map, compass, and a lightweight tent. I always bring my sidearm for protection, not because I expect trouble from people, but because of bears and mountain lions. These animals mostly avoid humans, but you never know. The day was clear, a bright blue sky with a few scattered clouds. I set out mid-morning, taking my time on the trail. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a fresh smell after recent rain a couple of days prior. The forest was alive, birds calling, chipmunks rustling in the leaf litter and the occasional woodpecker knocking on a tree trunk. I passed a small creek, its water cold and clear. I stopped for a moment, crouched by the bank, and drank directly from it. The water tasted crisp and clean. I kept an eye out for any signs of recent human activity, broken branches, discarded trash, or fresh footprints. But the trail was quiet. Aside from my own footprints, no one had been here for days. By late afternoon, I reached the boundary markers. They were still in place, weathered but readable. I took some notes and photos for the park's records. I knew I'd have to come back in a few weeks to check on the trail again, but for now, all seemed normal. I found a small clearing a little off the trail, perfect for setting up camp for the night. It had a flat, dry patch of ground surrounded by firs. The smell of pine needles was strong here, and the soft moss on the ground made for a decent bed. I set up my tent quickly, knowing the sun would be down in a couple of hours. After dinner, I cleaned up, packed away my trash, and sat outside the tent to enjoy the fading light. The forest was growing darker, shadows stretching long between the trees. The temperature was dropping fast, and the smell of damp earth grew stronger with the evening chill. As darkness fell, I turned on my headlamp to do a quick perimeter check. I scanned the trees for any movement. In this part of the forest, it wasn't unusual to see deer or elk come out at dusk, but I didn't see any that night. The silence was thick, the kind that feels like the whole world is holding its breath. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and settled in for the night. My radio was on, tuned to the Ranger channel, but I didn't expect any calls. The usual chatter had died down by now. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise outside. At first, I thought it might be the wind or a small animal moving through the underbrush. I sat up quietly, listening. The sound was soft but steady, something scraping against bark. It didn't sound like a deer or a small critter. It was deeper, heavier, like a large animal moving slowly, brushing against trees. I reached for my flashlight and peeked outside the tent. The beam cut through the dark, catching the rough shapes of trees and bushes. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, I caught a shadow moving, large, slow, deliberate. My heart started to beat faster, but I stayed calm. I knew bears lived in this forest, and a big male could easily stand 6 feet tall at the shoulder. I pulled out my sidearm, a precaution more than anything. The sound continued, low grunts mixed with the scraping of hooves or paws against bark. I grabbed my radio and keyed it. Base, this is Ranger Hollow. I'm hearing something moving outside my camp. Looks like a large animal, maybe a bear. Requesting a status check. No reply. The radio crackled with static, then silence. I tried again a few times. Still nothing. The batteries in the radio were full this afternoon, but maybe the range was limited here. The noises grew louder. The scraping turned into snapping branches, heavy footfalls pressing into the soft earth. I could hear the animal moving closer to my campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I remember my training: don't run, don't make sudden movements. Stay calm and wait for it to pass. I kept the flashlight steady and the sidearm ready. The sounds came right to the edge of the clearing, paused, then moved along the far side of the trees. For nearly an hour, the animal prowled around the clearing, circling slowly. I caught glimpses of dark fur between the tree trunks, the glint of eyes reflecting the flashlight. I could smell it too, a strong, musky scent of wild animal. I stayed awake the whole time, listening, waiting. The animal never tried to come into the clearing directly, but it was close enough to keep me on edge. Eventually, the noises faded and the forest grew quiet again. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was cool and damp. I looked around carefully. There were fresh tracks in the soft dirt, huge paw prints, easily twice the size of a large dog's. The prints circled my campsite multiple times. The ground was disturbed where the animal had scratched at tree bark, looking for insects or marking territory. There was no sign of any other animals or humans nearby, just my camp and the forest. I packed up slowly, making sure to leave no trace. The adrenaline was still in my veins from the night, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. The area was wild and dangerous, and this bear, or whatever it was, had made it clear that it claimed this place. On the way back down the trail, I stopped at the creek again and filled my water bottle. I looked back toward the clearing one last time. The forest seemed peaceful in the morning light, but I knew the truth. Out here, in the quiet, the wild still ruled. The animals were patient and strong, watching and waiting. Back at the ranger station, I wrote up my report, noting the large animal tracks and the night's encounter. I requested a patrol team to check the area during the day and install some wildlife cameras to monitor the animals' movements. The next few days were busy. Rangers came out, set up cameras, and scouted the area. The footage confirmed a large male grizzly bear had taken up residence nearby. Signs of feeding on fallen logs, fresh digs, and claw marks on trees showed this was a bear in prime health, fully aware of its territory. I learned something important that week. No matter how familiar you think you are with the wilderness, it can still surprise you. You have to respect the animals, respect their space, and never underestimate the power of nature. That night alone in the backcountry reminded me that the forest doesn't belong to me or any human. It belongs to those who live quietly in the shadows. And sometimes, those shadows come close enough to remind you who's really in charge. I've spent more than half my life in the woods. I've seen just about everything there is to see in the backcountry. Storms rolling over ridgelines like tidal waves, bear tracks outside my tent flap, even a black bear sniffing around while I was cooking dinner alone on a rocky outcrop in Idaho. I'm not easily rattled, but every time someone asks me what the scariest night I've ever had in the forest was, my mind jumps back to a night deep in the Manistee National Forest in Michigan. I was just a Boy Scout then, maybe 13 or 14. It was early fall, and we were out on a multi-day backpacking trip with our troop. I didn't know at the time, but that trip would shape the way I looked at the woods forever. It was the second night of the trip. We were deep in the forest, easily 5 or 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. No roads, no cell service, just forest stretching out in every direction, thick with hardwoods, pine, and underbrush. We'd hiked about 10 miles that day. Our legs were dead, our packs were sweat-soaked, and by the time we reached camp near a small creek, all we wanted was food and sleep. The scoutmaster and assistant scoutmaster, 2 men I looked up to and who seemed completely unshakable, picked a flat stretch of ground between 2 ridges. We strung up tarps for cooking, gathered water, and set up our tents in small clusters, spaced a bit apart but within yelling distance. The forest was quiet that night, still and calm like it had exhaled. I remember the sunset, how it fell through the trees in golden slats and caught the early color of the leaves, reds, oranges, even some yellow. The only sounds were the bubbling of the nearby creek and the soft murmur of scouts finishing up dinner and crawling into their sleeping bags. We zipped ourselves in for the night. I remember the way my sleeping bag felt. Cool at first, but warm once I'd curled up in it. My tent mate was already snoring before I finished pulling my fleece over my head. Then, just after I'd started to drift off, I heard it. It started low, almost like wind shifting through the branches. But there was no wind. The trees were still. The noise came again, longer this time. A high-pitched wail, not human, but not anything I recognized either. It sounded like it came from far off, echoing off the trees, maybe down the ridge to the east. Then a different noise. This one closer. A sharp shriek, like a scream, but not quite right. It rose in pitch and then cut off abruptly. My eyes opened wide in the dark. My heart was already racing. I didn't move. I just lay there listening. It didn't stop. Screams, shrieks, howls. Some sounded like they were coming from far away. Others were just beyond the tree line. They echoed through the forest, bouncing around until you couldn't tell where they'd come from. One would start low and rise until it turned into a sharp cry, then silence, followed by something else. It wasn't just one thing out there. It was several, at least 3, maybe more. And then came the sound that really froze my blood, the unmistakable thud of wood striking wood. Not a branch falling, not a tree creaking. A deliberate, violent crack, like someone swinging a baseball bat against a thick trunk. Once, then again, then a pause and again. Crack, silence, Crack. Each one rang out like a gunshot in the night. I wanted to unzip the tent, to look out, to see something, anything, but I couldn't move. My body was stiff with fear. Every muscle locked. I remember realizing I was holding my breath, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly, try not to make a sound. The noise kept going. It wasn't constant. It would go quiet for a minute or two, then start up again, different shrieks, low hoots, warbling yells, none of them normal. None of them right. And always that occasional crack of wood on wood. I don't know how long it went on. Time got weird. It could have been 30 minutes. It could have been 3 hours. Not a single tent unzipped. Nobody said a word. We were all awake. I know we were. You could feel it in the air. Every single person in that campsite was lying there, silent and terrified, hoping it would stop. Eventually, the noises faded. The last one I remember was a low, warbling moan that echoed out like a dying animal. And then, just silence. The woods settled again. The crickets came back. The air felt still and cold. I think I fell asleep from exhaustion more than anything else. When morning came, the camp looked the same as it had the day before. Everyone was up early. Nobody said a damn word about the night. Not even the loudmouth kids who usually joked around. We packed up quickly. No one dawdled. No one wandered off into the trees. The only person who acknowledged it at all was our assistant scoutmaster. He was a wiry guy in his early 40s who'd done a ton of wilderness trips. As we were breaking down tents, he muttered, "Those were some high-pitched coyotes last night." That was it. Just a comment. No one replied. No one laughed. We hiked all day in mostly silence, the way a group does when no one really wants to admit they're spooked. The trail twisted through old growth stands and across ravines choked with ferns. We kept a tight formation. I don't think we took more than a couple short breaks. Around midday, we crossed paths with a solo hiker heading the opposite direction. He looked to be in his late 20s, scruffy beard, solid build, like someone used to doing long miles. He slowed when he saw our group. He looked tired, eyes sunken, face tense. He spoke with our scoutmaster for a minute, asking if we'd been the ones making noise last night. He seemed genuinely pissed, said he'd been trying to sleep and was kept up by what sounded like people yelling and thrashing around in the woods. Said he'd even shouted into the dark for whoever it was to knock it off. Our scoutmaster told him it wasn't us, and the man just nodded tightly, muttered something, and continued down the trail. We didn't talk about it after that. We finished the trip 2 days later. Nothing else happened. The woods were quiet, normal. But I never forgot that night. Years later, I was in college, working part-time as a gearhead at a local outfitter. I got into long solo treks by then, Montana, Oregon, the Up. One night, I was falling down a YouTube rabbit hole of wildlife videos and came across a recording titled "Unexplained Screams in Manistee National Forest." I clicked it without thinking. The audio was grainy, obviously recorded from a distance, but the moment it started, my stomach twisted. It was the same sound, the same kind of scream. High, echoing, not quite human, not quite animal. Then, just like before, Astor's cracked star. A clear, heavy strike of wood on wood. My blood ran cold. I sat there listening, every hair on my arms standing up, all the memories crashing back at once. It wasn't coyotes. I've heard coyotes 100 times since then. This wasn't even close. The older I get, the more time I spend in the woods, the more I understand how little we really know about what goes on out there. The forest is big, huge. People think of national forests like they're parks, maintained, groomed, safe. But that's only a tiny fraction. Most of it is raw land, unmonitored, uninhabited. Anything can happen out there, and often does. People go missing. Tracks show up that lead nowhere. Weird things are heard, but not seen. What gets me most about that night isn't the noise itself. It's how everyone refused to talk about it. Like if we just pretended it didn't happen, it wouldn't be real. But it was real. I heard it. I still hear it sometimes when I'm lying in my tent, deep in a forest somewhere far from roads. That part of me that remembers being 13, zipped up in nylon, heart pounding, comes roaring back. Now, when I camp, especially with others, I always do a sweep of the area before dark. I listen. I look. I take notes. I don't assume anymore. Because the truth is, there are things in our own backyards that we don't understand. They aren't ghosts. They aren't monsters. They're real things, animals, people, or something in between, that live by their own rules. And they don't care if we hear them. That night in the Manistee was the first time I realized the woods aren't ours. We move through them. We visit, but they don't belong to us. And sometimes, if you listen closely, the woods remind you of that. I still go back. I still hike. Still sleep under the stars. But I never forget what I heard out there. And I never, ever assume I'm alone. Last year, I was working as a park ranger in Lassen Volcanic National Park. I had the day off and decided to take a solo hike to the thermal vents, one of the park's quieter, less crowded areas. The trail was about 4 miles out and back. Not too long, but I wanted to spend some time out there, just by myself. It was early fall, the air was crisp, and the colors of the trees were just starting to change. Normally, being in the forest like that makes me feel calm and focused. But that day, something was different. As soon as I parked at the trailhead and stepped out of my truck, I felt this wave of unease wash over me. It was a feeling I've had before, but rarely, like something was watching me or waiting for me, but I couldn't tell what. My skin prickled. The wind was still, and the forest was too quiet. No bird song, no rustling from squirrels or chipmunks. Just silence. I stood there for a minute, looking down the trail. The dirt path twisted through a dense stand of fir trees, the ground covered in dry needles. A few patches of fog clung low to the earth. I told myself to shake it off and keep moving. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my water and map, and started down the trail. The first half-mile was easy. The path was well-worn, and I recognized the smells: pine, damp earth, and the faint sulfur scent that meant I was getting closer to the thermal area. But that weird, anxious feeling stayed with me. I kept checking behind me, though nothing was there but empty forest. About a mile in, the trail opened up into a clearing with a small meadow. The grass was dry and brittle, crunching under my boots. The silence was even heavier here, and the wind was dead calm. I paused and looked around again, tried to catch a bird or some sign of life. Nothing, not even a breeze to stir the leaves. I took a deep breath and moved on, heading into the trees again. The trail climbed slightly and then flattened out near the thermal vents. The ground here was warm and cracked, with steam rising from small holes and pools. It smelled like rotten eggs. I knelt down and touched the warm soil, watching the steam curl up into the air. Despite the eerie stillness, the place was strangely beautiful. But the unease hadn't left me. My heart was pounding a little harder than normal. I packed up and started back the way I came. Then, somewhere a few hundred feet behind me, I heard a low growl. It was deep and guttural, barely more than a rumble, but froze me in place. My whole body tensed. I slowly turned my head to listen, eyes scanning the forest. There was nothing but the faint rustling of leaves in the dry underbrush. I didn't want to move. That growl was close. I thought maybe it was a coyote or some other animal. But then I remembered that the park was home to black bears, and I had heard warnings about them being active this season. My stomach tightened. I stood perfectly still, my eyes darting between shadows, trying to catch any movement. The growl didn't come again, but there was something just out of sight, moving slowly through the trees. Then I heard the crack of a twig snapping underfoot. Leaves rustled sharply. The sound was deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. I realized it was a bear. Not far, maybe 40 yards away, walking in the same direction as me, but a little off the trail. The black shape moved steadily through the brush, and my heart started to pound so hard I thought it would burst. My hands trembled slightly, but I knew I had to stay calm. I kept my eyes on the bear and started to walk slowly and quietly down the trail, careful not to make noise. I kept my voice low, almost whispering to myself, reminding myself not to run and not to turn my back. The bear didn't look like it was paying attention to me. It was focused on something ahead. The trail curved into a wide meadow, and the bear disappeared behind a cluster of bushes. I didn't hesitate. As soon as I was sure it was out of sight, I broke into a fast jog, my feet pounding on the dry earth. The trail seemed twice as long on the way back, but I didn't care. All I wanted was to get to my truck. 2 miles later, I reached the parking lot, heart still racing but relieved. I jumped in the driver's seat, locked the doors, and started the engine. I decided right then and there to leave that part of the park alone for a while. I drove to a busier, more popular area where I knew there would be other hikers and staff around. The secret sidewalk. Another time, a friend and I decided to explore a spot called the secret sidewalk in Niles Canyon, outside the city. It's an old aqueduct, abandoned and partly demolished. The concrete path stretches for a mile or so, surrounded by thick trees and brush. It's a quiet place, popular with locals who want to get away, but also a little creepy because it's isolated and wild. We climbed up to the aqueduct on a narrow dirt path and started walking along the concrete. The place was covered in moss and graffiti, and some sections were crumbling. The light filtering through the trees was dim and greenish. We took pictures near the end, where the city had started tearing down parts of the structure a few years ago. It felt like being inside a forgotten world. As we headed back, we stayed close, chatting quietly about the history of the place. Then, out of nowhere, we heard the loudest rustling of leaves and snapping of branches I've ever heard in the forest. It wasn't a small animal. It was heavy, fast, and close. We froze in place, staring into the thick brush beside the path, trying to see what could have made that noise. There was nothing visible, no flash of movement, no shining eyes. But the sound was too big for a squirrel or a raccoon. There are some homeless people who sometimes camp in the canyon, so I thought maybe it was one of them. But the noise was so sudden and strong it didn't sound human. And I knew from my work in parks and wilderness that large animals don't normally hang out in that kind of narrow canyon right next to city streets. We stood silent for a minute, heartbeats loud in our ears. The forest seemed to hold its breath. After a while, we kept walking, moving faster and more alert. We didn't say much the rest of the way. When we finally reached the parking area, both of us were quiet, just shaking our heads. That sound was something else. Something that reminded me that no matter how safe or familiar a place feels, the wild is always just beneath the surface, ready to remind you it's still there. Reflection. These experiences stuck with me because they reminded me how quickly things can change in the backcountry. As a park ranger, I've been trained to handle encounters with wildlife, especially bears, and to stay calm and prepared. But that day on the trail and at the secret sidewalk, I was reminded how small and vulnerable you really are in the wild. It's easy to forget how quickly a quiet forest can become a place where you feel watched, where every sound takes on a new meaning. And even when nothing visible appears, the unseen presence of nature's creatures is always there, reminding you to respect the space you're in. Now, I never hike alone in remote parts of Lassen without extra caution. I carry bear spray, I make noise on the trail, and I always tell someone where I'm going. Those feelings of unease, I don't ignore them anymore, because they're often your body's first warning, telling you to be alert. In the end, the forest didn't need to show me anything wild or supernatural. The wild itself, the real, living, breathing wilderness, is scary enough. It demands respect, and sometimes it demands you pay close attention to every sound, every shadow, every step you take. That day on the trail, I was lucky. The bear didn't want to fight. It just moved on. But I'll never forget that feeling, the tight grip of fear mixed with respect, that made me move faster and get to safety. That feeling is why we keep learning, keep training, and never take the wild for granted. Last summer, I was camping with my girlfriend and her family in the Adirondack Mountains near Warrensburg, New York. It was late August, and the air was still warm but heavy with that damp, earthy smell the forest always carries after a rain. The ground was soft, the leaves still green, and the sounds of the woods were alive. Crickets, distant birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. Her parents had bought a camper just the year before, a nice, newer model that still smelled clean inside, with fresh upholstery and a bright little kitchen. It was a 2-bunk camper, compact but comfortable for family trips. My girlfriend's younger sister slept on the top bunk. I was on the bottom. The beds were narrow but cozy, and the camper's windows were tinted dark to keep the heat out during the day. The window next to my bunk was tilted open just enough to let some fresh air in. That night, after everyone else had gone to sleep, my girlfriend and I were the only ones awake. She was sitting beside me on the bottom bunk, whispering softly. I was scrolling through my phone, trying to relax before sleep. The screen's glow was the only light inside the camper, casting pale shadows on the walls. Outside, the night was dark and quiet, except for the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Suddenly, I heard it, the faint sound of gravel crunching under footsteps outside the camper. Not far away, close enough that I could clearly hear the slow, steady steps on a gravel path that ran alongside our spot. The footsteps were slow and deliberate. 2 feet. It was clearly a person. The sound grew louder as the person walked closer and closer, until it stopped just outside my window. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. The tinted window was open just a crack, but it was too dark to see anyone's face. Whoever it was didn't move for a long moment. I kept my phone's light off and didn't breathe too loud. I was scared they might have seen the light and could be watching me. The camper felt suddenly small and vulnerable. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally started again, moving away slowly, crunching on the gravel as they faded into the woods. I waited a few minutes, too nervous to move. Then I quietly texted my girlfriend, who was right beside me, telling her what I had heard. She said she heard it too, and that her parents had been asleep but were now awake, listening. Just as we were trying to calm down, we both heard a different noise, the sharp sound of a zipper and rustling coming from the 2 tents about 10 feet away from the camper. The tents belonged to her parents and a younger sister's group. The noise was clear and deliberate, like someone was unzipping the tent and moving around inside it. My girlfriend woke her parents to let them know. They got up and went outside to check, but after 10 minutes, they came back saying they didn't see anything. The woods were empty. No shadows, no movement, no signs of anyone nearby. The air was still, and the only sound were the night insects and the soft wind through the leaves. The next morning, the tents were unzipped and left open. Her parents said they felt uneasy and asked the neighboring campers if they had heard or seen anything. The neighbors were an older couple who also camped there regularly. They said they had heard strange noises during the night, footsteps and rustling, but thought it was just animals or the wind. No one ever found out who had been walking around the camper or unzipping the tents. There was no sign of forced entry, no footprints aside from the normal animals, no stolen items or anything missing. The family didn't return to that campsite this year. That was the short version, but here's the full story with all the details, just like I remember it. The sun was setting behind the mountains when we finally pulled into the campsite. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the sky was a soft orange fading into purple. The camper was parked on a small gravel clearing surrounded by thick forest. Tall spruce and maple trees formed a natural barrier all around, their trunks dark in the fading light. A narrow dirt road led in and out, but it was quiet, just the sound of our car, tires crunching on the gravel, breaking the stillness. Her parents were busy setting up the tents nearby, while my girlfriend helped with the kitchen gear inside the camper. The camper itself was shiny and clean, the kind of camper that still smelled new, with the plastic smell of fresh upholstery and that faint scent of pine cleaner. It was big enough to fit the 5 of us comfortably, her parents, her younger sister, my girlfriend, and me. Inside, the layout was simple. 2 bunk beds on one side, the top bunk for the younger sister, the bottom for me. Across from the bunks was the small kitchenette and a tiny table. The windows were tinted dark, designed to keep out the hot sun during the day. The window next to my bunk was tilted open slightly to catch the cool night air. That first night, after dinner, everyone was tired. The younger sister was already asleep on the top bunk, tucked in tight with a worn stuffed animal. The rest of the family had gone to bed early in the tents, but my girlfriend and I stayed up a little longer. We sat quietly in the camper, the only light coming from my phone as I scrolled through some news and messages. The quiet hum of the camper's fridge, was the only mechanical sound in the otherwise natural silence. Outside, the woods were dark, and the last light had vanished behind the trees. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the camper through the cracked window. I could hear the faint sounds of the forest at night. Crickets chirping, a distant frog croaking, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. The air was cool, but not cold. Then I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. It wasn't like the soft, erratic sounds animals make when they move through the woods. These were slow, measured steps, and there was a clear rhythm. Left, right. Gravel shifted under the weight of boots or shoes, not paws. The sound came closer, until it stopped right beside the camper, near my window. I didn't dare move. My heart started beating fast, and I could feel sweat gathering on my palms despite the cool air. The camper felt suddenly too small, too exposed. The dark window next to me was just a thin sheet of glass, tinted but open. Whoever was outside could probably see inside if they wanted. I switched my phone off, hiding the screen's glow, and listened. There was no sound other than the faint breathing of my girlfriend beside me and the steady pulse of my own heart. The footsteps didn't move, didn't shuffle, just stayed still right outside. I stared into the darkness beyond the window, but couldn't see anything. The tint made it impossible to tell if anyone was actually there. Time seemed to stretch out. I wanted to call out, to wake someone, but I was frozen. Then, finally, the footsteps started moving away, stepping quietly over the gravel and fading into the night. I waited a few more minutes, listening for any more sounds. Nothing. I texted my girlfriend quietly, telling her what had happened. She said she had heard it too and was scared. We both listened again, holding our breath. Then, a new sound. A sharp unzip followed by rustling near the tents about 10 feet from the camper. It was unmistakable. The sound of a zipper sliding down and fabric moving as someone opened a tent flap. The noise didn't last long, but was loud enough to wake her parents. They got up, grabbed their flashlights, and went outside to check. I stayed inside, heart hammering, waiting for any sign of what was out there. 10 minutes passed. Then her parents came back inside, saying they hadn't seen or heard anything else. The woods were empty and silent except for the usual nighttime sounds. We tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but couldn't. The woods felt colder, darker, like the trees were watching. The tents were unzipped and left open in the morning. The older couple camping nearby told us they had heard footsteps and rustling during the night too, but assumed it was animals or the wind. We never found out who had been walking around our camper or going through the tents. No footprints, no evidence, no stolen items. Just those footsteps in the night and the feeling that we weren't alone. Her family never camped there again. And every time I think about it, I wonder what might have happened if I'd looked outside or if the person had stayed longer. Sometimes the woods are just woods, but sometimes there's something else. Something quietly watching, waiting. A few years ago, a group of us decided to hike up to the old abandoned zoo in Los Angeles. It wasn't a park or a normal hiking trail. It was this forgotten place tucked into the side of a canyon, long left to rot. The zoo had been shut down decades before, and most people didn't even know it was there. The whole idea was to get scared, really scared. We were 7 of us, all in our 20s, and had been pushing each other to take on more daring adventures lately. The goal was simple: walk the trail at night, reach the ruins of the zoo, and see if we could stir up some real fear. We planned it for a late summer evening. The air was already cooling off when we started, around 7:30 p.m., just as the sun was sinking behind the hills. The hike itself was about 2 hours, winding up a steep canyon slope. The trail was rough but walkable, mostly dirt and scattered rocks, with some wooden steps rotted or missing and handrails long gone. The whole place looked like it was swallowed by nature. Vines creeping over old fences, trees growing where paths used to be, and fallen signs faded past reading. At first, nothing felt scary. We joked around, threw flashlights back and forth, and talked loud to keep the mood light. The first half of the trail was lined with thick chaparral bushes, some scrub oak, and dry brush. We saw a few small animals. A rabbit darted across the trail, and later some little rodents scurried between rocks. The night was mostly quiet, except for the distant hoot of an owl somewhere high up in the trees. The owl's call was eerie, sure, but also just natural night sounds. Nothing weird yet. We kept moving up, taking breaks here and there to catch our breath. The path got narrower as we climbed, and the air smelled like earth and dry leaves mixed with something faintly metallic, probably rust from the old zoo cages. It was hard to imagine what used to be here, but you could tell there was a lot of history. The rusted cages, some bent metal bars sticking out of the ground, and old concrete foundations overgrown with moss and dirt. Around the 3/4 mark, the trail turned sharply and got really narrow. It squeezed between a steep rock face on one side and a sheer drop into the canyon on the other. The path was maybe 2 feet wide at best, forcing us to walk in a single file. We had to turn sideways to fit through, brushing against the rock wall with one shoulder while trying not to lose our balance on the loose gravel underfoot. Our flashlights, which had been steady so far, suddenly started to flicker. The lights would dim, then brighten, then cut out for a split second before coming back. It wasn't a steady flicker, more like an uneven pulse. At first, we thought maybe the batteries were dying. The flashlights had been sitting and used for a while before the trip, and some of us had cheap ones. Nobody said much, though. We had phone lights as a backup, and the group was still pretty chatty, just nervous in a joking way. Then the guy at the front of the line stopped walking. We all piled up behind him, unsure what was going on. He didn't say anything, just stared straight ahead, completely frozen. I was fourth in line, so I got a good look at what he was staring at a couple seconds later. There, walking calmly down the narrow path toward us, was a man dressed entirely in white. It wasn't just white clothes. He had on a white shirt, white pants, white boots, and even a white top hat. His hair was white, or maybe powdered to look white, and his face was partially covered by some kind of white cloth like a bandana or a scarf wrapped around his mouth and nose. He moved slowly, with a strange confidence, like he didn't belong there, but somehow owned the place. The trail was so narrow, we were pressed tight against the rock wall, walking sideways to fit. He just passed right through, walking straight past us without hesitation, as if we weren't there. The guy in front still hadn't said a word. I felt my stomach twist, a cold wave of unease that I tried to push down. My heart was pounding loud enough to drown out the faint sound of the wind. There was something about the man's slow, deliberate walk and the way his white clothes contrasted against the dark canyon that made it feel surreal. Like seeing a ghost, but not a ghost. Something else, something real but out of place. His eyes caught mine for a split second above the cloth, and I swear they were completely calm, almost bored. I wanted to call out to ask who he was, but my voice was stuck. The guy behind me started to breathe heavily, and I could hear the others shifting nervously. We all watched as the man disappeared around a bend in the path, his white figure fading into the dark. That moment broke something in me. So much for being tough guys. We quickly decided it was time to turn back. No one wanted to push forward, not after seeing that strange figure. There is an old saying among us, something like, if you mess with the devil, even when you think you're done, he's not done with you. We hurried back down the trail, the narrow passage feeling even tighter on the way back. The flashlights flickered again, but we didn't care. Our phone's lights were steady, and we focused on the trail. When we finally reached the parking lot at the bottom, the place looked normal again, but then I saw something that froze me. Around our car, there were dozens of small orbs of light circling quickly, like tiny fireflies, but too bright, too steady, and too fast. They moved in tight circles around the vehicle, flashing white and pale yellow. We pointed them out to each other, some of us snapping pictures with our phones. But as soon as we focused on them, the orbs vanished. 1 second they were there, the next nothing. None of us could explain it. The man in white, the flickering lights, the orbs, none of it made sense. We drove off without looking back, all of us silent, the night suddenly feeling heavier than when we arrived. Since then, I haven't been back. I won't go back. I don't know who that man was or what those lights were, but I learned something real that night. Some places hold on to stories. Not the kind you read in books or see in movies, but the kind that make you question what's real. and some things don't want to be disturbed. The abandoned zoo is one of those places. I'm a park ranger now, and I've seen a lot of strange things out in the wild, but nothing like that night. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales. It was something else, something that feels like a warning. You don't have to believe me. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or was someone else out there playing a prank. But know what I saw, and I know one thing for sure. There are places you should leave alone. Ocala National Forest is thick. That's the first thing I tell people who've never been. Not just with trees, but palmetto, scrub, underbrush that'll grab your boots and tear your pants. Pines grow up tall and straight, and everything's got thorns or teeth. It's beautiful, but it's wild, and sometimes it's unsettling. Me and my buddy Jace were out for hogs that night, a couple miles deep into the north end of the forest, north of Lake Delancey. We parked off a sandy forest road just as the sun was starting to dip, hiking in with rifles, knives, and gear. I had my AR with a mounted light and a .45 on my hip, and Jace had a similar setup. I also had a big flashlight in hand, one of those high-lumen tactical types that can double as a club if needed. We'd been hunting hogs in the forest for a few years, usually off-trail, and we always carried heavy. Not because of bears or cats. We knew the area well enough, but because of the two-legged problems that sometimes crop up in places like Ocala. Poachers, meth cookers, squatters, or just weird loners. You keep your head on straight and your eyes open out here. But honestly, we weren't feeling edgy that night. It was peaceful, warm, but not too hot. The moon was damn near full and bright enough that we didn't even need the rifle lights unless we were going through thick brush. We felt good. We followed a series of old logging trails, narrow but distinct enough in the moonlight. We were well into the grid system they used to cut the forest, square mile sections crisscrossed by old, overgrown roads. A lot of it's still navigable on foot or ATV if you know what you're doing. We figured we'd loop through one of the bigger quadrants and circle back to the car before 1 a.m. That didn't happen. Around midnight, we realized we were a lot deeper in than we planned. Between tracking sign, dealing with some thick scrub, and just plain not paying attention to time, we ended up probably 3 or 4 miles from the car. Not dangerous, just inconvenient. We could have bivvied and hiked out at dawn, but we had the gear, lights, and weapons. So we kept going, sticking to the trails as best we could. Then things started getting weird. We were maybe halfway through the quadrant, cutting across one of the thinner trails when we heard it, crashing through the woods, maybe 40 or 50 yards to our right. Heavy fast. We stopped and listened, weapons at low ready, trying to get a fix on it. It was moving perpendicular to us, right to left, like it was about to cross the trail up ahead. Could have been a deer. Could have been a bear. Either way, no shooting at night. Plus, if it didn't see us, it had just passed by. I didn't want to blind it with a rifle light, so I raised my handheld flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, waiting until it got close to the trail. A second later, I hit the switch. The beam lit up the trail in front of us, cutting through the trees like a spotlight. About 50 feet ahead, something crossed. 2 white legs. That's all we saw. No shoes. No pants. Just pale, bare legs running full speed through the trail and back into the brush on the other side. We both froze. I lowered the light slowly and looked at Jace. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. We were both thinking the same thing. What kind of idiot runs barefoot or in shorts through thick underbrush at 1 in the morning? It didn't make sense. Even drunk campers don't go crashing off trail like that, especially not without a light. There weren't any campgrounds near here, and this part of the forest had no cabins or public sites. Closest real facilities were miles away. No reason for anyone to be out here, especially not alone and unarmed. But we weren't paranoid. Like I said, we were loaded for hogs. We pushed on. We didn't want to backtrack. That would have taken a lot longer. The trail wasn't great, overgrown and narrow, but it was faster than looping back around the whole quadrant. Besides, whatever it was had moved past us. We figured maybe it was a meth head or someone living off-grid. Weird, but not our problem. We kept hearing movement every so often. Distant crashing, sometimes behind us, sometimes off to the side. Never close, never approaching, like it was pacing us from a distance. That's when I started feeling it. You know that feeling when you know you're being watched? That prickling between your shoulder blades, even when nothing's there. That's what hit me after the third or fourth sound. Something about it felt off. Not just strange, wrong, but I kept it to myself. Jay's probably felt it too, but neither of us said a word. We didn't stop again until we saw the car. It was untouched. No broken windows. No signs anyone had messed with it. That was a relief. I half expected to find the tires slashed or a note under the wiper or something stupid like that. But it was just sitting there, same as we left it. We loaded up. Rifles stayed hot. Handguns in the center console, just in case. I got behind the wheel and pulled out onto the sandy road, slow and easy. Ocala roads aren't made for speed, especially at night. Moonroof open. Stars like a painting above us. You forget how dark the sky can get out here, with no towns, no lights, nothing. It's almost peaceful again. Almost. Then we saw him. Half a mile down the road, maybe less, the headlights swept over a figure walking toward us on the right side of the road. A man, buttoned-down checkered shirt, shorts, pale legs, no pack, no flashlight, nothing in his hands. He didn't look at us, just kept walking like we weren't even there. We didn't stop, didn't slow down, just passed him and kept going. I checked the rearview mirror. He never turned, just disappeared into the dark behind us. We didn't talk about it on the way out, not until we hit the pavement miles later. I pulled over just long enough to unload the rifles and lock them in the trunk. Then we drove home. We told a couple close friends. Nobody believed us, or they said we were overreacting. Some people think forests are quiet, peaceful places. They are, until they're not. I've been back to Ocala since then. I like the challenge, the wildness, the way it pushes you to stay sharp. But I don't go into that part of the forest at night anymore. I also don't go unarmed. Ever. There's something going on in that quadrant. I don't know what. Could be a poacher camp, could be someone cooking meth, or some crazy squatter living out there. Maybe they put up signs or scare tactics to keep people away. Maybe we stumbled too close, and that was their warning. Let us see just enough to remember, but not enough to understand. Either way, message received. There's a quiet part of the forest near Lake Delancey where the trails get narrow and the trees grow close together, where the stars shine through just enough to see by, and the night wind rustles the brush like whispers. If you go there and you hear something in the woods, something fast, moving low with bare legs and no light, just keep walking. Don't follow it. Don't turn your light on. And whatever you do, don't stop. I've worked as a backcountry ranger for years, long enough to see most of what nature throws at a person. Lightning storms, flash floods, people getting lost and found. A few who didn't get found. I've seen wreckage from plane crashes, old mines full of rotted support beams, cougars pacing just out of sight. But there's something about certain pockets of wilderness that feels off. Not because of ghosts or monsters or any of that movie nonsense. Just something deep in your bones that tells you to pay attention. To be careful. I never used to believe in that kind of gut feeling. Then I solo packed into that stretch of the Mogollon Rim. This wasn't the dry, red dust Arizona most people think of. Not this place. This was high country, up around 7,500 feet. Cool, wet air. Dense forest that smelled like pine and wet moss. You get big Doug firs up there, heavy with lichen. Wild strawberries creeping over the forest floor. Ferns almost waist-high in places. Thorny brambles growing where the sun touched down in slanted fingers. The kind of place where everything feels like it's growing on top of everything else. Old logs buried under green. Mushrooms sprouting from stumps. A thick canopy overhead that keeps the light dim even at noon. I'd planned a solo route out there over 3 days. Nobody around, which was the whole point. I've been doing interpretation for months, junior rangers and Boy Scout talks, and evening campfires with groups. All good work, but sometimes I need the quiet. I pick remote stretches of trail that even the hunters ignore, places you have to bushwhack into, sometimes following old game trails. This trip was a loop that dropped down off the rim through thick forest, followed an unnamed drainage for a while, then climbed back up through a series of steep benches, natural terraces carved out by ages of erosion. I'd marked one particular bench on the map that looked like it might be good for a first night camp. It sat just above a creek on a ledge that floodwaters must have carved out decades ago, maybe longer. Getting there took most of the day. The air was wet enough that my shirt stayed damp even though it wasn't raining. Everything I touched had a film of moisture on it. Logs, rocks, branches. The brush was dense and thorny in places. I got clawed up on my forearms a few times, especially where I had to push through blackberry tangles. I saw signs of old pot grows here and there. Plastic tubing half buried in mud, tattered black trash bags shredded by years of sun and rain. One clearing had rusted chicken wire and empty soil bags. All of it long abandoned. No recent boot prints. No trash newer than 5 years. But still, it puts you on edge finding that kind of thing. Even if it's old, those sites aren't on maps. You only stumble across them if you're where you're not expected to be. I reached the bench around 5 p.m. It was smaller than I imagined from the topo map, maybe the size of a big living room, just like I'd guessed. Flat enough to sleep on, but not by much. On one side, a brush-covered slope so steep it might as well have been a cliff. You couldn't go up or down it without a lot of noise. The other side dropped off in a sheer undercut, dropped to the creek 10 or 15 feet below. No way in or out of this spot except a steep game trail I'd come up on, winding through thick brush and broken rock. It was a good spot for solitude, a poor spot for surprises. I set up my tent near the center of the bench. Just a simple single-wall, one-man shelter. Gray, low profile. I boiled some water, made dinner, freeze-dried chili mac. Checked in with my satellite communicator, which took longer than usual to get a signal through the heavy tree cover. Eventually the message got out. Camp for the night. All good. That's what I send every night. Then I shut it off. No need to waste battery. I hung my bear bag on a stout limb, double-checked the knots. Not because of bears necessarily. I hadn't seen any fresh scat or prints. But food draws all kinds of creatures. I've had raccoons unzip packs before. Once a fox made off with half my jerky. The sun went down early, thanks to the steep terrain and thick canopy. By 8 p.m., it was properly dark. New moon. Overcast. No stars. No light from the sky at all. I brought a book, but reading by headlamp makes me tired, so I lay back and listened. That's when I noticed how quiet it was. Utter silence. I mean that literally. No wind in the branches. No frogs calling. No bugs. Not even the high whine of mosquitoes near my ears. The only sound was the faint trickle of the creek below, soft enough that it faded into the background. I've camped in a lot of quiet places. High alpine lakes. Winter forests. But this was different. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, where your own breathing sounds too loud. You become aware of your heartbeat, of your blood in your ears. That kind of quiet. It was spooky, but I told myself it was fine. Some nights are just like that. I fell asleep sometime after 10, zipped into my bag with the tent flap partly open for air. I woke up to bright white light. It wasn't sunrise. It wasn't my flashlight. It was a sharp, clean light that lit up the inside of my tent like someone had parked a truck and flipped on their high beams. I bolted upright, heart hammering. First thought, someone was here. Second thought, someone was here on purpose. I scrambled for my light, unzipped the tent, and shoved my boots on barefoot. The second I moved, the white light blinked out. Not faded, just gone. Snapped off like a switch. I stood outside in the dark, shining my own light in wide arcs. My beam was strong, a 1,000 lumen handheld I trust with my life. I swept across the trees, up the slope down toward the creek. Nothing. No movement. No colors or shapes. No eye shine from animals. I clicked it off and listened. Silence. If someone had come up the trail, I would have heard them. There's no way around that. The path was so steep and narrow that even a careful step breaks sticks or shifts rocks. It had taken me 5 loud minutes to climb it, and I'd made plenty of noise. There was no other approach, not unless someone rappelled in from the brush above or climbed up from the undercut creek bank with a ladder. I stood still and let my eyes adjust. Off through the trees, I caught the faintest flicker of light. Not white this time, more of a glow. Pale, unsteady, like someone holding a lantern behind thick plastic. Then it was gone. I waited. Nothing came. No sound of retreating boots. No branches snapping. No engine noise. Just that slow, steady trickle of water down in the creek. I stayed up the rest of the night, just sitting on my foam pad with my back against a tree and a light in my lap. I didn't doze. I kept the light off except for quick scans every few minutes. But nothing returned. No more light. No more sound. Just that quiet. It stayed dark for hours. The clouds never broke. Even as dawn approached, I didn't hear the usual early morning bird song. No sparrows. No chickadees. No warblers. Nothing. At first light, I stood up and walked the perimeter of the bench. My footsteps were loud in the quiet, boots crunching on needles, twigs snapping under heel. I looked for tracks. None. No impressions but my own from the night before. I checked the trail where I'd come up. Still only my boot prints. No scuff marks or broken branches that hadn't already been there. I checked the slope above. Too steep to climb without hands and knees. No sign of anything coming down that way. I checked the edge of the creek. A sheer drop-off. Nothing had come up that side, either. It was like nothing had been there at all. I took a long time packing up. Made coffee. Ate a bar. Double-checked everything. I didn't feel washed exactly, but I didn't feel alone either. And that silence, it just kept going. All morning. No birds. No bugs. Not even a squirrel in the trees. Just that same slow trickle of water in the creek below. I left the bench by 9, climbing down the game trail the way I'd come. I hiked slowly, scanning my surroundings constantly. I didn't relax until I was several miles away and birds started singing again. It was like crossing some invisible line. 1 minute total silence. The next, a jay called out from the trees, and I nearly jumped. I didn't camp a second night. I made the rest of the loop in one hard push and got back to my truck just before dark. I messaged my family from a turnout where I finally had enough signal. Headed home. Uneventful trip. That was a lie, but I didn't feel like explaining. Back at home, I reviewed my GPS data. Nothing odd. No movement outside the tent. No new tracks. My satellite communicator didn't record any attempted messages while I slept. I even checked the timestamps on my flashlight and headlamp batteries. No weird drain. Everything worked as expected. It could have been someone else out there, I guess. But why not say anything? Why light up my tent and then disappear? And how'd they get in and out without a sound? I thought about hikers with night vision or poachers using IR lights. But even those give off a red glow and I saw white. Bright white. And I would have heard something. I should have heard something. I didn't. I'll never know what the light was. Maybe a fluke. Maybe a person I'll never meet. Maybe something mundane that just didn't make sense at the time. But that silence, the kind of dead, I've spent most of my life in the woods. Grew up in the Sierra foothills, hunting, fishing, and hiking since I could carry my own pack. By the time I hit my 20s, I'd been through most of the trails and drainages across El Dorado National Forest. My friends and I used to go out damn near every other weekend. Just a bunch of local guys who'd known each other since middle school, always looking for that next patch of wild to explore. One of our favorite places to camp was along Sopiago Springs. That whole stretch of forest felt untouched. You didn't hear road noise. There weren't signs of other people. Just thick pine and fir woods, a few rocky clearings, and that clear mountain stream cutting through it. We had a particular spot just a ways off a trail. No markings, no signs, just a little hollow tucked between a couple boulders with enough flat ground for a few tents and a fire ring we'd stacked up ourselves with river stone. That spot was gold to us. It had been a few months since we'd made the hike out there. Life gets in the way, jobs, girlfriends, the usual. But that one weekend in early September, the four of us, me, Nick, Trevor, and Luke, blocked out 3 days to do a foraging trip. It was something we'd done before, kind of challenge. We'd pack light, just MREs for backup, rifles and shotguns for small game, some shelter gear, and the clothes on our backs. We'd gather whatever we could from the woods, berries, trout, squirrels, even mushrooms if we could ID them right. We started out on a Friday morning, parked the trucks down the service road, then hiked in about 3 miles. The air smelled like warm pine and granite dust, with that cool edge you get in the shade from the stream. Camp was just like we left it. Overgrown, sure, but untouched. No boot tracks, no new cuts in the wood, no trash. We got settled fast. pitched tarps low between trees, and cleared brush around the fire ring. We hit the stream with hand lines and caught a bunch of crawdads, and Nick bagged a squirrel with his .22. We roasted everything up, mixed in some wild onions we found, and washed it down with a few warm beers we hauled in. It was a good night, laughter, stories, and that kind of tired satisfaction that comes from working with your hands and being outside. That first night, we all slept fine, but the next morning, I woke up feeling off. Hard to explain. It wasn't just a bad dream or being sore from hiking. The forest felt still, too still. I've been around bears. I've seen cougars. You can feel when a predator is close. Birds go quiet, chipmunks disappear, that sort of thing. But this was more than that. There was no wind, no birds, not even the usual lazy buzz of flies or bees. Just this dead, waiting silence. We all noticed it, though nobody said much. We ate the last of the squirrel with some jerky from an MRE and set off in pairs. Trevor and Nick headed up the creek to scout for berries and maybe fish. Luke and I went the other way, checking a few known patches for mushrooms and nuts. Around mid-afternoon, Luke and I made it back with a decent haul. Some more crawdads, 2 rabbits, and a half-pound of wild hazelnuts. Nick and Trevor weren't back yet, but that wasn't unusual. The stream was long, and they might have found a good fishing hole. The feelings still hadn't gone away, though. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Every little crack of what made me pause. I've never been a jumpy guy, but something felt off in my gut. It felt like being watched, not just watched, but studied. The sun dipped fast behind the trees, and I was alone in camp while the others were still upriver. They'd gone maybe 200 yards away. Not far, but with the forest as dense as it is there, it felt like miles. I kept the fire going strong and set the rabbits to roast. But that unease kept creeping in. Then I started hearing voices. Faint, real low, almost like whispers. Not like animals, not like the wind. It wasn't just sound, it had rhythm. Patterns, almost like human speech, but just far enough away that I couldn't pick out words. The weirdest part was it came from the woods opposite the creek, opposite where the guys went. It wasn't echoing from them. It was something else. I grabbed my rifle and scanned the tree line through the scope. We only had 2 flashlights, and Nick and Luke had taken them both. That was a dumb move. All I had was firelight and moonlight, and the moon wasn't up yet. I was watching the woods, trying not to blink too much, when I saw something move. It was about 50 yards out, just at the edge where the firelight faded into shadow. A low shape, moving smooth, slow, like it was stalking. I brought the rifle up and found it in the scope. My heart was pounding in my ears. The thing looked human, it was down on all 4s, but not crawling like a person. Its arms were long, swinging out in front of it like an ape. But it was thin, gaunt. I couldn't make out details, just that hunched outline. It paused for a second like it saw me. Then it slipped back into the shadows without a sound. I stayed locked on the direction it went. Nothing. No more movement. But then I started hearing the forest again. Little things. A rustle here. A twig snap there. All around the backside of camp. In a semicircle from the opposite direction of where my friends had gone. It wasn't random. It felt like it was testing me. Probing the edge of the firelight. Watching me watch it. I stoked the fire as big as I could. Sparks shot up 10 feet into the trees. I didn't care if I burned a whole cord of wood. I wanted light. I held a rifle and just kept glassing the tree line, sweeping the scope slowly, try to control my breathing. I didn't see it again. Maybe 10, 15 minutes later, I heard footsteps, human ones. Nick and Trevor came back into the light, eyes wide, spooked. I must have looked just as messed up. I told them what I saw. They didn't say much, just nodded. Then Nick said they turned back early because they'd started hearing whispering sounds in the trees, too. That's when I knew this wasn't just in my head. We stayed up the rest of the night, built the fire even bigger, put our backs to it, and rotated watch. None of us slept. We didn't talk much either, just listened. Every so often, you'd hear something, footsteps crunching just out of sight. Something breathing heavy for a second before it disappeared. Always just far enough to make you question it, but not far enough to ignore. By the time the sky lightened, we were already breaking down camp. We didn't even eat. Packed fast and quiet. Got everything back into our packs and started hiking out as soon as there was enough light to see. We didn't talk on the way back. Just kept moving. That silence followed us halfway back to the road. Every now and then, I'd see something off to the side, a shadow between trees, the glint of movement. But when I looked, it was always gone. When we got back to the trucks, we didn't say goodbye like usual. We just tossed our gear in and drove off. Each of us peeled off to our own place. We never went back to that spot. Over the years, we talked about it a few times. Not often, just when a story came up about weird stuff in the woods. Each of us remembers the same things. Those whispers, that shape in the trees, that silent pressure like something was waiting. Not a ghost, not a monster. Just something we weren't supposed to see. I've worked wildland since. Done fire lines, survey hikes, camped solo for work plenty. I've run into bears, watched cougars from 20 yards off, even tracked wolves out in Idaho once. Nothing ever felt like that trip. Nothing made the woods go dead, quiet the way that did. And nothing ever made me leave a place and swear I'd never come back. But that stretch along 𝐲𝐸𝐷𝐸𝐸, I won't set foot there again. Not alone, not with a team, not for anything. Some places in the forest just aren't meant for us. And sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you can see. It's what you know is out there, but never shows itself again. I was working a fall seasonal ranger detail in Wisconsin, not far from Waukesha County, at a place called Indian Mound Reservation. IMR for short. Most folks in the region know it from scouting. Big place, old growth mixed with prairie clearings. Sits on what was once Menominee and Potawatomi land. The kind of place that makes you feel small the second you step onto it. Not because of size, because of history. The place gets its name from the burial mounds scattered through the forest. They look like long, low berms in the leaves. Maybe 3 or 4 feet high, 20 or 30 feet long. Some shaped like bears, birds. Others just long humps of earth. I had read the brochures like anyone else. I knew better than to walk over them or disturb them in any way. But no one really trains you for the feeling you get being alone in a place like that. That week, I was working alone. The usual team had been split between events at a nearby scout leadership camp and trail clearing at the far end of the reservation. I volunteered to stay behind and man base camp at Oak Hollow. Fewer kids that time of year, just a handful of troops on late season badges. The leaves had already turned. A steady wind kept the trees whispering, all gold and red under that steel, gray Midwestern sky. And the nights? Cold, damp, perfect for keeping noise down. Every footstep echoed in the leaves. I had my tent pitched down by the staff sites, not far from the old fire ring and the creek. It was maybe 100 yards from the nearest scout site, out of sight behind a stand of oaks and pines. We liked it there because it was far enough to get quiet but close enough to respond fast if a kid got hurt or panicked in the night. I had done overnights in worse places, but I'd never done one so alone. That first night went easy. I did the evening rounds, made sure all the troops were accounted for, and retreated to my tent a little after 9. No fire. Too dry. I lay in my sleeping bag, reading by headlamp. Wind moved through the trees. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until I woke up, probably just after midnight. At first, I didn't know why I was awake. My brain caught up slowly, the kind of wake-up where you don't move. Your body just listens before you open your eyes. Something had clicked in me, and I wasn't sure what. The woods were quiet. Too quiet. No crickets. No wind. That's what did it. Then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound like boots through wet leaves. 2 steps. Pause. 2 more. It wasn't far off, maybe 20 feet away, circling my tent. I kept still. I didn't even sit up. Just turned my head slightly and listened. 2 steps. Pause. Drag. Leaves moving slow. Definitely bipedal. It moved around the tent clockwise, then paused again. I heard it stop directly by the front of my tent, maybe 2 feet from where my head was. Not breathing, not shifting, just standing there. My hand was on my flashlight. Not a big mag light, just a small one-clasp LED I kept looped through the inner tent mesh. I didn't switch it on. I didn't unzip the tent. Something in me knew not to. I just lay there, eyes open, every hair on my arms standing straight up, my ears filled with my own heartbeat. Then the steps again, slower this time. circling back, counterclockwise, same distance. It made 2 full loops, and then nothing. No footsteps, no movement, just the sound of a breeze kicking up again. I lay there for what felt like an hour, but must have only been 10 minutes. Eventually, I turned on the flashlight and scanned the inside of the tent. Everything normal. I reached for my boots, unzipped the flaps slowly, and poked my head out. The woods were still. I stepped out, walked the perimeter with the light low, checked the tree line. Nothing. Not a branch out of place. Now, I've dealt with everything from bears to tweaked-out squatters in the woods. But I knew that wasn't a bear. A bear doesn't walk slow and quiet around a tent. And squatters or trespassers, they don't do laps. They don't stand still that long without making a sound. I try to shake it off. Maybe a deer. But deer don't walk like that either. I went back into the tent. Slept light. Real light. Every rustle pulled my eyes open. The next morning, I got up early and made a full inspection. Looked for prints. Nothing solid. It had rained a little the day before. But I did find what looked like a few scuffs in the leaves. Long drag marks that didn't lead anywhere in particular. Just scattered, then gone. I didn't say anything to the troops. I figured maybe one of the older scouts wandered in the night and got cold feet. But something didn't sit right. That day, I kept my rounds. Went site to site. Checked food storage, fire pits, first aid kits. But I couldn't stop thinking about the sound. The way it walked. That night, I moved my tent closer to the ranger shack. Less remote, but still not right in the thick of the campers. I figured if it was some prank, the kids wouldn't follow me that far from their bunks. Same routine. Lights out by 9:30. Still, cold. I fell asleep eventually. And I slept. But I didn't sleep well. Every little sound set me off. A squirrel dropping from a branch. The creak of bark in the wind. But no footsteps. Nothing like the night before. And that should have been a relief. But it wasn't. Because that's when I realized something. The whole camp was too quiet. No laughter. No late whispering. Even a forest was holding its breath. The burial mounds out there, they don't look like much to most people. Just humps under the leaves. But there are dozens. All over the property. One of them sits not 50 yards from where I'd pitched my first tent. I hadn't even thought about it when I set up. But now I could see it clearly in my mind. That long, low rise, half covered in moss. And suddenly, I remember the rule. We don't camp near them. Not because of superstition. Because we're told to show respect. I hadn't. Next morning, I moved my site again. Packed up early and shifted to the back of the main lodge. Too far for any scouts to wander. Too close for any nonsense. That day, one of the senior leaders asked me if I'd been hearing things. I just shrugged. Said something vague about animals. Didn't want to feed into campfire stories. Didn't want the scouts afraid to sleep. But I did some reading that afternoon. Dug into the archives in the ranger cabin. A binder with old reports. Stuff going back to the 70s. One entry stood out. Dated October 1983. A ranger had logged hearing repeated night pacing near the same area I'd been in. No visual contact. No signs of animals. The entry had been flagged once in 1996 when another staffer reported unexplained foot traffic and leaf disturbance during an off-season cleanup. I stopped reading after that. I didn't sleep easy the rest of the week. But I wasn't scared. Not in the ghost story kind of way. More like a slow pressure. Like the woods were reminding me to stay in my place. On my last night, I walked the ridge above the mounds one last time. Didn't get close. Just watched from the trail. The moon was full, and the leaves had thinned enough to see the shapes beneath the trees. The earth wasn't disturbed. The mounds looked the same, but I didn't linger. I felt seen, not watched, asterisk seen star. Like the land knew I was there and was waiting for me to leave. I did. In the morning, I packed up before dawn, said my goodbyes, signed the logbook, and drove out with the windows down and the air sharp in my lungs. I've camped all over the Midwest and up through Superior since then. Done overnights in the Rockies, even a season in Northern California. Nothing has ever quite felt like that week at IMR. No ghosts, no monsters, just something older than either. Something that expects quiet and respect. I don't tell the story much, but sometimes when I'm training new seasonal staff and the subject of camping near burial sites comes up, I just say, don't, and that's enough. I had just pulled into town earlier that morning. I'd been on the road a while, making a loop through the South to check off some Civil War sites I'd never been to. I work as a ranger out west, mostly in forested areas, but when I get time off, I try to see what else the country holds. Not every ranger sticks to the wilderness. Some of us are drawn to history, especially the kind you can walk through. I checked into a modest roadside hotel off I-20, left my pack in a room, changed my shirt. It was already soaked through with sweat, and drove into the main entrance of Vicksburg National Military Park. The gate stood tall, flanked by wrought iron. A green sign with white lettering read, "Welcome to Vicksburg National Military Park." The ranger in the visitor booth waved me through after I paid my /$12 entry fee. I took a park map from the little wooden kiosk by the gate and slowly started following the paved auto tour loop. I remember immediately feeling a difference in the air. And I don't mean weather. It was blistering hot, no doubt, southern summer heat, thick and pressing. But the moment I crossed under that archway, something shifted. There was stillness in that park, like the air was listening. To either side of me were rows of monuments, columns, engraved stones, carved marble soldiers, some tarnished by time, others pristine and white as bone. Each one marked a regiment, a commander, or a state's contribution to the siege. I passed monuments from Ohio, Illinois, Iowa, Union territory this side of the line. Farther down the road would be Confederate markers, but for now, I was driving in Union territory. The trees lining the road were mostly hardwood, oak and hickory, and the shadows they cast over the pavement danced slightly in the hot breeze. I slowed down near an open clearing, a slight rise in the earth, and saw a weathered Civil War cannon perched just outside a small thicket of trees. It was facing downhill toward a dense tree line, no doubt where Confederate lines had once stood. I pulled off to the side of the loop and cut the engine. It sputtered a bit before dying, older truck, loud when idling. I grabbed my Nikon from the passenger seat and stepped out. The heat hit me like a wave, the kind that presses into your skin, not just from above, but from all around. Southern humidity is a different kind of beast, like walking through a stew. I walked slowly toward the cannon, keeping to the gravel shoulder and not stepping into the tall grass. This was tick and snake country, and even off duty, I'm not careless. The cannon itself was old, cast iron, likely original to the period or close to it. A placard beside it explained its placement, belonging to a Union artillery regiment that had fired from this exact spot for 47 days straight during the siege in 1863. The gun had been aimed at a Confederate position across the valley, some 400 yards away, according to the sign. The wear on the cannon's muzzle made me think it had seen serious use. I crouched to get a better angle for a photo and zoomed in on the texture of the iron. The surface was pitted with age, but the lines were still clear. Then, instinctively, I stood up and looked toward the trees. And I froze. There was a man standing just within the tree line. I didn't move. I didn't even raise the camera. Just stared. He was maybe 10 or 15 yards away, wearing a dark blue jacket, well, by the look of it, with brass buttons. A kepi cap sat square on his head. The kind you see in old photos, short brim, flat top, folded down slightly in the front. He had a rifle slung over one shoulder. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking at me either. He was looking slightly to the left, like watching something beyond the hill. For a second, I thought maybe he was a reenactor. That made the most sense, but there was no living history event scheduled that week. I checked the park's calendar online before coming down. Besides, it was too hot for anyone to be walking around in full Union garb without a good reason, and without water, and without any gear besides the rifle. Then something else occurred to me. I could see the trees behind him, not in the spaces around him. Through him, the man wasn't fully solid. He looked faded, dim, not translucent like a pane of glass or a mist, but like a photo taken in poor light. Like he wasn't here, so much is remembered. Then, before I could even process what was happening, he took a step forward and vanished. No sound, no rustle, nothing, just gone. I stood there, rooted to the spot, stomach tight and chest heavy. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was something deeper, a kind of stillness, like the world had held its breath. I stayed like that for maybe a minute. maybe less. Then I slowly walked backward toward my truck, eyes still fixed on the trees. I opened the door without turning around, climbed in, and locked it. I sat for another few minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't even pick up the camera again. Didn't take another photo. When I finally turned the ignition, my truck started on the first try. I pulled slowly back onto the loop road and drove the rest of the route in silence. Windows up, AC on full blast, map folded and untouched on the seat beside me. I didn't stop again. That night, back in the hotel, I sat at the small desk by the window and dictated everything I'd seen into my phone. I didn't trust my memory. I wanted it fresh. I listed the time, 1:40 p.m. I noted the weather, the location of the cannon, the exact appearance of the soldier. Everything. I've worked as a ranger long enough to know that sometimes strange things happen in quiet places. This wasn't supernatural. It didn't feel like a ghost. It felt like a playback, a recording, like a groove in the land that had been walked so many times that the imprint was permanent. That spot had seen death, thunder, smoke, fear. I think sometimes under the right conditions, places remember. I didn't report it. Who would I tell? The hotel clerk? My supervisor back west? No one would care, or worse, they'd laugh. So I kept it to myself. Until now, the thing that stuck with me wasn't what I saw. It was what I didn't see. There was no awareness in that man's eyes. No recognition of the modern world. No sign of thought. He was moving through something old, stuck in some moment long past, playing out a fragment of history like a scratch on a record. That was my first time seeing something like that. And I think it was real. Not a ghost. Not a fantasy. Just a piece of the past repeating. I haven't been back to Vicksburg since. Maybe I will one day. But not in the summer. And not alone. I've seen wildfires eat forests whole. I've seen rock slides crush roads and hikers disappear into canyons. I've seen what lightning does to a ridgeline when it hits at full force. But nothing has stuck with me the way that moment did. Maybe it's because trees regrow. Maybe it's because people don't. I was out on a solo camping trip, something I do pretty often when I get a break from work. I'd packed up my old Subaru with my usual gear, tent, bear can, food for a few days, water jugs, the works. I brought my dog Casey like I always do. She's a mid-sized mutt with shepherd in her, sharp senses, and usually calm as hell. She's been with me for 7 years now. We've camped in rain, snow, and everything in between. Never once has she acted the way she did that day. This was somewhere in the Klamath backcountry, not far from where I do most of my field work. I've been scoping out a few new fire roads and side trails the week before and remembered this spot, kind of tucked away on a ridgeline above Oak Hollow. It wasn't an official campsite or anything, just a nice flat shoulder off a forest road with decent tree cover, a bit of shade, and enough of a view that I could see for miles. I figure I'd head out there after work on Friday, take a few days to just unwind, let Casey run around, do some journaling, maybe scout for sign. I wasn't expecting anything weird. If anything, I was looking forward to a quiet stretch alone. I pulled in late afternoon. The sun was still a few hours from dipping, but it was low enough to cast long shadows through the firs and manzanita. It was dead quiet, no traffic on the road for the last hour. I hadn't seen another car since the turnoff. That's when Casey started acting up. As soon as I got out of the car, she froze, hackles up. She stood stiff beside the bumper, eyes locked on the slope above the road. Ears flat, low growl rumbling in her chest. I figured she'd picked up on a deer or maybe a bear in the brush. We see both all the time, but she wouldn't calm down. I leashed her and tried to walk around, thinking maybe stretching her legs would help. But she was all nerves, grumbling, staring into the trees, constantly looking over her shoulder. She kept pivoting toward the hill above us, like she expected something to come out at any second. I gave it a good 45 minutes, tried walking her up and down the fire road, got out my gear, even unrolled the tarp to make her more comfortable. Nothing helped. She wouldn't settle, and then I started hearing the voices. At first, I thought it was wind through the trees. You know how sound carries weird up in the hills, especially when there's elevation changes and open air. It sounded like men talking, low, kind of flat, like they were just over the next rise. I couldn't make out what they were saying at all. It was like a murmur, but it had weight to it. It was close. Closer than made sense for me, not being able to hear words. I paused, listening, thinking maybe a couple guys had parked on the other side of the ridge. But I never heard any engines, and the sound would just disappear. Then come back. Sometimes from the left, sometimes right above me. Casey growled louder when the voices came back. Ears pinned, body low like she was ready to bolt. I called out once, just a hey there. Nothing. The voices didn't respond, just kept going like they couldn't hear me. Or it didn't want to. Then they'd vanish again. Something about it felt wrong. I've camped solo dozens of times in way more remote areas than this. But the hair on the back of my neck was up. It wasn't just a dog. It was my gut. The longer I stayed, the heavier it all felt. Like we weren't supposed to be there. I figured maybe there were guys up there who didn't want company. Could have been poachers, or growers, or just some backwoods types who didn't like people stumbling into their spot. I've worked around enough of them to know how that goes. I've run into grow ops deep in the woods before. You don't mess around with that. If you feel off, you get out. So I packed back up fast. Didn't even set the tent. Tossed everything in the back and got Casey in the car. She was still growling, low and steady, staring out the window toward the hill. I started driving back down the fire road, slow and steady. It's a narrow track, barely one lane, loose gravel in places. You can't really rush. But I kept looking in my mirrors. I felt watched. That pressure didn't go away until I hit pavement again. When I got to pull out near the highway, I stopped to catch my breath and get my bearings. Casey was calmer by then, but she was still glued to the passenger seat, watching the trees. I sat there with the engine idling, window cracked. The sun had dipped behind the ridgeline. Everything felt sharper in the cooling air. Now, like I said, I know sound can travel weird in the hills, and I know there are logical explanations for weird feelings. But I've spent years in forests, working fires, guiding trail crews, clearing deadfall, mapping timber stands. I've been alone in plenty of places. Never once felt what I felt up there. I didn't sleep that night. Took a room in a little highway motel instead. Casey paced for hours, only laying down once the sun came up. The next day, I went back. I had to know if I'd missed something. Maybe I'd imagined more than was really there. I went up during daylight, solo. Left Casey behind, which was the first. I parked at the same spot and hiked in slow, keeping my eyes open for signs of activity, boot prints, cigarette butts, campsites, anything. I brought a radio, not that I expected to need it. I kept my phone out, GPS on, tracking the area. There was nothing. No tracks, no trash, no trampled brush, not even deer prints. Just dry pine needles and old leaves. It was like no one had been there in weeks. But the weirdest part was the acoustics. I did some tests. Called out, clapped, even played a recording from my phone of someone talking. Sound didn't carry up or down the ridge the way I'd expected. It got swallowed by the trees. If someone had been up there talking, I would have heard them clearly. Or not at all. But not like that. Not that weird almost hearing where the voices seemed to be right there, but I couldn't catch a single word. I didn't stay long. Hiked the slope, checked the hollow below, came up with nothing. I didn't feel the same dread as the night before, but it was empty. Too empty. No birds, no squirrels, no rustling, just stillness. I drove back to base after that, didn't camp again for a few weeks. I've told this story a few times to guys I work with, fire crews, timber techs, other rangers. Most just shrug, say it could have been echoes, distant campers, something totally harmless. Maybe it was. Maybe I spooked myself. But when I remember that trip, I don't think about the voices so much as how Casey acted. That dog has faced down bears without flinching. She's walked through lightning storms calm as a monk. But she wouldn't even leave the car once we got back. And when a dog like that tells you something's wrong, you listen. I don't go back to that ridge anymore. There are 100 other places to camp, and I don't need to prove anything to myself by sleeping on top of a place that didn't want me there. I mark it now when I'm mapping. Good terrain, but not worth the feeling. There's nothing supernatural about it. Just something in the woods that day, maybe people, maybe something else that didn't want company. And I'm okay leaving it alone. Sometimes your gut tells you what your eyes can't. And if you're smart, you listen. I camp solo a lot. Part of it's the freedom. No permits, no neighbors, and no noise, other than the trees shifting in the wind or the creek down the ridge murmuring through the dark. I'm not one for developed campsites with fire rings and vault toilets. I want to be out there, way out there. Places where I can let my dogs run, where I don't have to hear cars or worry about other people wandering up on me. For years, I did this all across the West, especially in national forests and parks where you could hike in and vanish for days. Nobody would know you were out there. Over time, though, it got harder. The unease started small. My dogs would growl at night, low and sharp, pointed into the dark. I'd get up and sweep my headlamp around, half expecting to see a bear, but there'd be nothing. No sounds of movement, no smell of animal, just still woods. A kind of stillness that didn't feel empty. It felt like holding its breath. That stuff always rattled me more than I let on. It was never one big thing either. It was always small stuff. Like once in the Cascades, I found a pile of skinned rabbit carcasses about 2 miles off any trail. They were still wet, some meat still pink, but no scavengers had touched them. No tracks in the pine needles. Nothing. Just laid there like someone left them for me to find. Another time, up in Klamath National Forest, I thought I heard a voice one night. Not close, faint but clear, like someone saying something short, then going quiet. I couldn't pick out the words. I got out of the tent with my dogs on alert, but I didn't find anything. I stayed up until first light. No firelight through the trees. No footsteps, but I kept feeling like something was near. Still, I kept going out. I told myself it was just the wild being wild. Animals do weird things. People do weirder. And I always told myself I had the dogs, and I had my gear, and I knew the land well enough to read it when something was off. But last year, late September, I had the one trip that finally made me stop camping solo for a while. I planned to spend 3 nights in 6 Rivers National Forest, just past the Trinity Alps, northeast of Eureka. The air was just starting to change, cool in the mornings, but still warm in the afternoon. I'd scoped out an area on topo maps. No official trail, just an old fire road that led into a thick basin with creeks and a few small clearings perfect for a tent and some off-leash time for the dogs. It was maybe 9 miles in, uphill most of the way. Rugged terrain, dense woods, a place nobody goes unless they mean to. I packed light, just the essentials, enough food for 4 days, water filter, rifle, tarp, tent, bear can, and of course the dogs. I had 2 back then. Luna, my old blue healer, and Scout, a younger mutt with hound blood and way too much energy. The hike in was uneventful. The woods were quiet. No other cars at the pullout. I parked off the fire road, double-checked my topo, and made my way in. The forest closed in thick after the first few miles, redwoods giving way to fir and cedar, with big mossy outcrops that looked like the bones of the earth itself poking through the duff. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. Just big enough for a tent and a fire pit someone had built years ago. It looked undisturbed. No trash. No human sign. The place smelled like clean water and leaf litter. I pitched the tent, let the dogs roam, got a fire going. I always camp with a full perimeter check before nightfall. It's a habit I picked up early on. Walk the area in a circle out about 100 yards. I look for signs of recent activity. Tracks, broken branches. Scat. Anything. This time I found nothing, and that should have made me feel better. But it didn't. The place was too still. I don't mean quiet, I mean still. Even the birds went quiet around dusk. No rustles. No owl calls. My dog stuck close after dark too, which wasn't like them. Luna especially. She'd normally go crash in the bush or curl up under a tree, but she stayed pressed up against the tent flap all night, staring out. The first night passed slow. I slept lightly, one ear open, which was normal. The next morning I made coffee, fed the dogs, and we went exploring along the creek. Spotted some deer tracks, some old bear scat. Nothing fresh. I didn't see or hear a single human sign all day. But that night, things started to feel wrong. Around midnight, Luna growled. Not her usual low grumble. This was sharp, alert, her whole body tensed. Scout stood up next to her, ears forward. I opened the tent flap and peered out. Nothing. Not at first. Then I heard it, movement. Soft but deliberate. Not close, but not far either. Like something stepping lightly across the forest floor, maybe 50 yards out. then stopping. I waited. I didn't call out, just listened. After a long pause, I heard it again. One step, then silence. I got out of the tent with my headlamp and the rifle. I scanned the trees, the underbrush. I didn't see any eye shine, no shapes. The sound didn't return. After 20 minutes, I crawled back in the tent, boots still on. The next morning, I did another perimeter check. I found tracks, but not animal. Barefoot, human. The prints were faint, but they were there, just outside the clearing, heading in a slow circle. The ground was damp enough to hold shape. The prints were narrow, long, no tread marks, and there were no prints leading in. Just a circle, like someone had come out of the woods in the middle of the night, walked around my camp, and slipped back in. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing. I've dealt with squatters and off-grid folks before. Most are harmless, or they want to be left alone. But this was off. No gear, no boots, no sign of someone living nearby. Just prints. I took the rifle with me to gather firewood that day. The third night, it got worse. I didn't sleep at all. The dogs were on edge the moment the sun went down. They kept looking in the same direction, north, toward the thickest stretch of woods where the creek narrowed into a draw. Around 1 a.m., Luna barked. One hard, loud bark, then silence. I grabbed the rifle and flashlight again. This time, I didn't just hear movement. I saw it. Something stepped behind a tree about 40 yards out, just out of full beam. It was tall, human-shaped, but fast. Too fast. I didn't call out. I didn't fire. I just waited. My heart hammered so hard I could hear the blood in my ears. Scout started whining, low in his throat. Then something hit the tree next to my tent. Not a rock, too soft. I looked and saw a small bundle of sticks tied together with what looked like bark or twine. I didn't touch it. I swept the area with my light again. Nothing. Just trees. Just dark. I left at dawn. Didn't pack neatly. Just stuffed everything in my pack, leash on the dogs, and moved fast. I didn't eat, didn't filter water, didn't look back. The walk out felt longer than the walk in. The woods felt tighter, like they were watching. I kept expecting to see someone step into the path, but no one came. The entire hike out, I saw no animals. No birds. No squirrels. No sound except my boots and the panting of my dogs. When I reached the fire road and finally saw my truck, I felt like I could breathe again. Before I drove off, I looked back once. Just trees, but I swear I saw a shape. Tall, still, watching. I didn't report it. Who would I report it to? There's no crime in walking barefoot in the woods. No law against weirdness. But I haven't camped solo since then. Not in the deep wild, not without backup. I still go out, but not alone. And not without telling someone where I'll be. Some people say the scariest things out there are bears or cougars. But I think it's the people. The ones you never see. The ones who leave no trail. The ones who wait until the fire goes out before they move. The forest has rules, but not everyone out there follows them. And not everyone wants to be found. It was late September, the kind of late September that starts to hint at fall, but still holds onto some stubborn summer warmth. I've been working as a park ranger in the Northern Forest District for about 5 years by then, mostly patrolling remote trails and keeping an eye on backcountry campers. This particular day, the sky was mostly clear, pale blue with a few thin clouds stretched out like wisps of smoke. The trees were already beginning to change, faint yellows and reds here and there, but the forest still felt thick and green overall. My shift started mid-afternoon. I had just finished a quick lunch at the ranger station, a sandwich and a bottle of water, and I was supposed to check on a few trailheads around the south side of the park. Those trails were less popular, but still used by some weekend hikers and hunters gearing up for early season. The forest was quiet, with only the usual sounds of birds and wind in the branches. I loaded my gear into the ranger truck, standard issue. Radio, flashlight, a first aid kit, a can of bear spray, and a small folding shovel. The truck's tires crunched on the gravel as I drove out. The air smelled earthy, a mix of pine needles, damp soil, and the faint musk of fallen leaves starting to rot on the forest floor. When I reached the first trailhead, I pulled the truck over and stepped out. The small parking lot was empty except for some scattered leaves blowing across the asphalt. I walked down the trail, a short way to check on a couple of old signs. The wood was weathered, but still readable. Nothing out of the ordinary so far. As I headed back toward the truck, a sudden noise caught my attention. It was a sharp, repeated thud coming from deeper in the woods. I stopped and listened carefully. The sound was too rhythmic to be an animal, maybe someone chopping wood or hammering. But this was a protected area, no cutting trees without a permit, and I hadn't heard any reports of maintenance here. I radioed the station to report the noise and told them I'd investigate. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, reminding me to stay alert and careful. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound deeper into the forest. The trail was narrow and winding, lined by thick underbrush. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The thudding noise grew louder with each step, but it wasn't steady. It came in bursts, then stopped for a few seconds, then started again. I stayed low, scanning the area for any signs of people or equipment. After about 10 minutes, I spotted something unusual. About 50 yards off the trail, near a small clearing, there was a pile of freshly cut wood. The logs looked like they had been chopped recently. Some still had green leaves on the branches. There was also an old, rusty axe stuck in one of the logs. I felt a chill run down my spine, not because of ghosts or anything supernatural, but because cutting wood here was illegal without a permit. Someone had been here recently, and I hadn't been notified. I called it in and asked for backup. As I examined the area, I noticed something else. A small, shallow hole had been dug near the pile of wood. The dirt around it looked loose and freshly disturbed. I stepped closer and realized the hole was about a foot deep and maybe 2 feet across. Something about it seemed off. I radioed again, describing the hole and the wood pile. They told me to wait for a fellow ranger to arrive and to keep an eye on the area, but not to touch anything else. While waiting, I took out my camera and snapped pictures of the scene. The sun was starting to dip, and the forest was growing darker. The peaceful quiet of the day was now replaced by the faint sounds of critters stirring in the underbrush and the occasional distant call of a crow. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a faint trail of footprints leading away from the clearing. They looked fresh, about the size of a medium boot, and headed east, deeper into the woods where the terrain got rougher. I debated whether to follow the prints. It was getting late, and the forest could get dangerous after dark, especially alone. But something told me I couldn't just leave it. I radioed again, saying I was going to check the prints briefly, but would stay close to the clearing. The footprints led me along a faint game trail, barely wide enough for one person, winding between thick trees and moss-covered rocks. The light was fading fast, and soon my flashlight became the only thing cutting through the gathering darkness. About 15 minutes into the walk, the trail opened onto a narrow ridge with a steep drop on one side. The trees thinned out here, and the wind was sharper, colder. I stopped and looked down the slope. Near the bottom, I saw an old cabin, half hidden by overgrown bushes and vines. It was weathered and falling apart, shingles missing, paint peeling, windows dark and cracked. This cabin wasn't on any official park map. I hadn't seen it before, though I'd spent a lot of time in these woods. The footprints ended right at the cabin's door. I felt a mix of curiosity and caution. This place looked abandoned for years. Why had someone been chopping wood nearby? And what were they doing here? The hole, the woodpile, the prints, it all added up to something strange. I stayed quiet and edged closer to the cabin. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the old wood creaking loudly. Inside, the air smelled musty and damp. Dust and spider webs coated every surface. There were old cans, broken furniture, and a cracked stove. It looked like someone had left in a hurry a long time ago, or maybe lived here secretly. Suddenly, I heard a noise from the back room, a soft scraping sound like something being moved. My heart pounded. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam caught on a large, dark object lying in the corner, covered by a dirty tarp. I pulled back the tarp and found a large pile of stolen wood, logs, planks, and chopped branches. It would match the pile I'd seen outside. Then I noticed something worse. A few large, freshly dug holes in the floorboards of the cabin. They were shallow, but clearly recent. And near one hole, I saw a shovel leaning against the wall, still wet with dirt. I radioed the station immediately, requesting backup urgently. My voice was steady, but inside, I felt a knot tighten. Someone had been using this cabin to illegally harvest wood and dig in the forest floor, possibly to hide something. I checked the rest of the cabin carefully. There were signs of recent human presence, footprints in the dirt outside, cigarette butts, and some canned food. The sun was almost gone, and twilight settled in fully. I stayed inside the cabin, flashlight sweeping every corner, waiting for backup. About 20 minutes later, I heard voices on the radio. Other rangers were close. I felt a wave of relief. We searched the area together, finding more signs of illegal wood cutting and shallow holes dug around the cabin and nearby trees. The rangers set up a perimeter for an overnight stakeout to catch whoever was responsible. I stayed in the cabin, alert and ready. As the night wore on, the forest around us grew eerily quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. No footsteps, no voices. At dawn, the rangers and I split up to search the surrounding forest. About a mile east, I found a shallow grave, barely covered with dirt and leaves. Inside were several small logs, part of the stolen wood, and a bundle of tools. Someone had tried to hide the evidence, but clearly hadn't finished. The other rangers radioed in that they had found a pair of muddy boots near a river crossing a few miles away. The boots had fresh blood on them, and footprints led to a broken-down dirt road. We called in the local police, who took over the investigation. In the days that followed, the authorities tracked down a man living off-grid not far from the park boundary. He had been stealing wood for firewood and building materials and hiding it in the old cabin to avoid detection. The blood on the boots turned out to be from a recent cut on his leg, likely from walking through thick brush and sharp rocks. He was arrested and charged with multiple violations, including trespassing, illegal harvesting, and destruction of park property. I went back to the cabin a week later, this time during daylight and with a maintenance crew. We cleared out the area, repaired the door, and marked the site for official removal. The forest started to feel peaceful again. What stuck with me most wasn't the danger itself, but how close it had felt. Someone living in the woods, hiding, digging shallow holes, stealing wood to survive, or maybe out of desperation. It reminded me how wild and unpredictable the forest could be, not because of animals or ghosts, but because of people. The woods don't need monsters. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones rooted in reality, in the choices people make, and the fragile balance between us and the wild. By the end of that week, I understood something important. My job wasn't just about protecting the land from nature or fantasy threats. It was about protecting it from ourselves. And that responsibility weighed heavy, but it also made me more determined. Every day, I walk those trails knowing the forest keeps its own secrets. And sometimes, so do the people who live in or near it. But with patience and vigilance, the forest could stay wild, safe, and free from harm. And that was a good ending. The sun was setting behind the thick trees, casting long shadows over the narrow dirt road that led into the heart of the park. I was driving my old Ranger truck along the winding route, the engine humming low and steady. It had been a long day, checking trail markers, inspecting campsites, and making sure everything was in order for the weekend crowds. It was late October, the air cool and dry with that crisp edge only fall could bring. The forest around me was a mix of towering pines and oaks with leaves turning rusty reds and golds. The ground was littered with fallen leaves that crunched softly under the truck's tires. The smell of pine resin mixed with the damp earth filled the air. I was on my way to check a small backcountry campground tucked deep in the woods, a spot only a handful of hikers found each year. It wasn't far from the main road, maybe a few miles on a narrow logging track that was more suited for hiking than driving. The last few miles, I would have to park and walk in. I pulled off the road at the trailhead and killed the engine. The quiet was immediate and thick. No birds sang, no wind rustled the leaves. Only the distant drip of water from the last rain echoed faintly. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, checked the radio for a signal, nothing but static, then stepped out. The dirt trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, and slick with dead leaves. The woods pressed in close on either side, dark and dense. I walked carefully, my boots making soft thuds on the earth. My breath puffed out in small clouds, visible in the chilly air. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was fading to a deep blue. I kept my flashlight off for a moment, wanting to rely on the last natural light. It helped me spot fresh deer tracks and the broken twigs of a small animal that had passed through earlier. The forest smelled sharp, wet moss, with smoke from distant cabins, and something else, a faint, odd scent I couldn't place. It was faint, almost metallic. I stopped and scanned the trees. Something was wrong. The forest should feel alive with small noises. Birds settling in for the night, squirrels rustling in the canopy, frogs croaking near the streams. But here, the silence was too complete, too unnatural. I switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark. The trail ahead was empty, but I noticed something off on the side. Broken branches, crushed leaves, a strange path leading away from the main trail. It looked fresh, like someone or something had recently passed through in a hurry. I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the sense that I wasn't alone. I pocketed the flashlight and kept walking. My steps slowed. I scanned the trees carefully, trying to tell if it was a human or animal that had gone off the trail. The broken path led toward a steep slope, down to a small creek I knew ran through that part of the forest. I decided to follow it. I moved quietly, careful not to make too much noise. The slope was steep and covered in wet leaves, making each step tricky. At the bottom, the creek gurgled quietly, the water dark and cold. There, by the edge of the water, I found something strange, a discarded backpack, torn and dirty. It wasn't like the usual litter campers left behind. This was old and looked like it had been through a lot. I crouched down, shining my flashlight inside. It was empty, but for a few torn scraps of cloth and a water bottle half full and covered in dirt. No name tags, no ID, just an abandoned pack in the middle of nowhere. I stood up and looked around. The area was small, shadowed by tall firs and cedars. The silence pressed in on me again. I checked my watch. Nearly 7 p.m. now. The forest would be fully dark soon. I had to decide whether to keep going to the campground or head back. But something kept pulling me toward the creek, like a knot in my stomach telling me to look more. I followed the creek upstream, moving slowly over wet rocks and fallen logs. The light from my flashlight bounced off the water and into the trees. I kept my ears sharp for any sounds, but there was only silence and the distant drip of water. After about 20 minutes, I noticed footprints in the soft mud beside the creek. They looked recent, too fresh to be from earlier in the day, and they weren't animal prints. They were human, booted and deep. Someone had been here recently. The footprints followed the creek upstream, sometimes near the water, sometimes climbing over rocks. They were single, like someone walking alone. I pulled out my radio to call in, but the signal was dead. My heart beat faster. I knew the park well, and this area was remote, seldom visited except by a few hikers in summer. Nobody should be out here now. I debated whether to follow or go back to base and call for backup. The backpack and footprints suggested someone was lost or in trouble. I chose to keep moving, hoping to find them before dark. The trail disappeared completely as I climbed a steep bank, the trees thick and close. My boots slipped on wet leaves and mud. I heard a faint noise, a twig snapping far ahead, maybe 50 yards or more. I froze. I strained my eyes in the flashlight beam, but saw nothing moving. Just dark shapes of trees and shadows. I called out softly, "Hello? Are you okay?" No answer. Only the echo of my voice bouncing back. I moved forward carefully, stepping over roots and stones. The creek curved away, and I lost sight of it behind a wall of brush. Then I saw it. A small clearing with an old cabin, half collapsed and overgrown with vines. It looked abandoned, but something about it was wrong. There was no way it should still be here, hidden deep in the woods like that. I approached slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and broken glass littered the ground. The smell hit me before I saw anything, an acrid, chemical smell mixed with something else like burnt plastic or oil. I shone my light inside. The cabin was empty except for a few scattered cans, some old blankets, and a pile of broken glass bottles. But then I saw it. Marks on the wall, scratches that looked recent and deep, as if someone had clawed at the wood to get out or signal for help. The back wall had a large hole, broken through with rough edges. The ground outside the hole was disturbed, trampled down like someone had crawled out. I moved to the hole and looked into the dark woods beyond. The footprints from the creek led into the trees and vanished. I called my dispatch again. No signal. The sun was almost gone, and the forest was dark now, except for my flashlight's beam. I debated whether to try to follow the trail in the dark or go back and get help. The responsible thing would be to turn back. But something told me that whoever was out here, they needed help. The abandoned pack, the footprints, the marks on the cabin walls, they all pointed to someone lost or trapped. I decided to keep moving, staying close to the trail as I followed the faint footprints into the woods. The darkness swallowed me as the beam flickered on and off. I felt the cold closing in around me. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept telling myself to stay calm. This was the forest. People got lost sometimes. I was trained for this. I had a radio, a knife, a flashlight, and my knowledge of the land. Hours passed. The cold seeped through my jacket. My legs ached from climbing over roots and rocks. I stopped occasionally to rest and listen. Nothing but silence and the soft rustle of the night wind through the trees. Then, just when I thought I would have to turn back, I saw a faint light flickering through the trees. I hurried toward it and found a small fire, barely burning, surrounded by scattered gear and footprints in the dirt. No one was there. I called out again, my voice loud and clear. No answer. I searched the area carefully, but no sign of anyone. The fire looked old, maybe hours or a day old. I sat down nearby, exhausted and cold. I realized this was someone's campsite, someone who had been here and then vanished. I decided to wait until dawn, hoping the person would return or I could find more clues in daylight. The long night passed slowly. I stayed alert, scanning the dark woods around me. My flashlight was low on batteries, my radio still dead. At dawn, I found fresh footprints heading downhill toward the park's southern boundary. I followed them carefully. By midday, I reached a service road I recognized. It led back to the ranger station. I reported everything. The backpack, the cabin, the fire, the footprints. Search teams went out immediately. Days later, they found a man a few miles away. He had been hiking alone, got lost, injured his leg, and crawled into a small ravine. He survived by drinking rainwater and eating berries, but couldn't call for help. He was weak, but alive. I stayed with him until help arrived. It was a relief to see his face, tired but grateful. That night, back at the station, I sat by the fire, thinking about how close he had come to dying in the dark woods. How the silence and shadows could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. I understood then that the forest was not haunted by ghosts or monsters. The real danger was the cold, the darkness, the endless quiet that could make you lose your way. And sometimes, the scariest thing wasn't what you saw. I was alone that day. No other rangers were with me. My truck was parked back at the ranger station more than 10 miles away, and my only company was my radio, but the signal was patchy, dead at times, swallowed by thick walls of fir and cedar that crowded the trail. I had my pack loaded with the usual stuff: map, compass, water, some food, first aid kit, a flashlight, extra batteries, and my knife. My job was to do a routine patrol of the backcountry trails in the northern section of the forest. The place was a remote stretch, old-growth trees, mossy rocks, thick underbrush, and streams that wound their way through the wilderness. I had been walking for hours by then, the trail rough and uneven under my boots, covered with pine needles and the occasional broken branch. The air was cool, damp from overnight rain, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. The only sounds were the crunch of my steps, the distant call of a jay, and the soft whisper of wind through the trees. I was supposed to check a trailhead at the far side of the forest, a place called Stone Creek. It was popular with hikers in the summer, but mostly quiet now. The fall rains had started, so there were fewer people. I expected maybe 1 or 2 day hikers, if any. Around mid-afternoon, about 4 hours into the hike, I reached a small clearing near an old wooden sign that warned of unstable ground ahead. The trail curved sharply there, narrowing between two tall pines. I paused to check the map and to take a drink from my water bottle. That's when I saw something odd. A backpack lying on its side a few feet off the trail, half covered by leaves and pine needles. The color was faded but still recognizable. A dark green pack, heavy looking. Someone had obviously left it there recently. I knelt down and checked the pack. It wasn't locked or secured in any way. I unzipped the main compartment carefully. Inside was a half-empty water bottle, a small first aid kit, some food bars, and an old crumpled map of the area. Nothing alarming, nothing that immediately suggested trouble. I looked around, expecting to see someone nearby. Maybe the owner was resting a little farther down the trail, or had stepped off for a moment. But the clearing was empty. No footprints or signs of anyone else around. I called out softly, "Hello? Anyone here?" No reply. I frowned. It didn't feel right. Leaving a pack here, unattended, was strange. But it wasn't unusual for hikers to set down their gear while scouting ahead or resting. I decided to keep moving, hoping I'd find the owner soon or come across some clue. As I continued along the trail, the woods grew thicker. The trees were older here, the canopy dense enough that little light broke through. The air smelled wetter, colder. About a mile farther, I came to a narrow wooden bridge crossing a shallow stream. The boards creaked under my weight, damp and slippery. I noticed fresh footprints in the soft mud at the water's edge. Human prints, size about average, no boots, just the shape of bare or thin-soled shoes. I looked closer. The prints led upstream toward a steep incline covered in brush. I could hear the faint sound of something moving through the undergrowth, a snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I hesitated. My training told me to be cautious. Someone was here, nearby, but no one had reported lost hikers recently. I kept my hand near my radio and knife. The sound came again, a little louder, a quick rustle. Something or someone was moving quietly, trying to stay out of sight. I scanned the slope carefully, but saw only thick bushes and shadows. Then I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting between the trees, too quick to identify. I called out again, this time louder. "Hey, if you're lost or need help, come out." No reply. My heart beat faster. The silence around me felt heavier. I decided to follow the prints, moving slowly, stepping carefully to avoid noise. The trail was rougher here, less worn, more wild. The footprints led to a small clearing with a fallen tree, moss-covered and huge. There was something else here, a makeshift campfire pit, cold and scattered with old ashes, but the ground around it was freshly disturbed. Someone had been living here, at least temporarily. I looked around the clearing. A thin blanket lay folded on a rock, and some scraps of food wrappers were half buried in the dirt. I checked my watch. It was about 5 p.m., and daylight would fade soon. The idea of spending the night out here alone was not appealing. I radioed my station. "Station, this is Ranger 7. I found evidence of recent human presence off the main trail near Stone Creek. No sign of the person yet. Requesting backup or at least a status check." Static was all I got back. I cursed under my breath. Cell coverage was terrible. Radio was spotty at best. I packed up quickly and decided to head back toward the trailhead, hoping to catch whoever was here before dark. As I moved, I kept my eyes sharp, ears alert for any sounds. The forest was quiet now, except for the occasional bird call and my own breathing. About half a mile from the clearing, I spotted something that made my skin crawl. A pair of boots, lying abandoned near the base of a huge cedar tree. No person around. I walked carefully toward them, looking for signs of struggle or clues. Nearby, I found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, dark, maybe part of a jacket. Something wasn't right. I tried to stay calm. The sun was dipping low, the shadows stretching long. I debated calling it in and heading out fast. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement again. Behind a tree not far off, a figure crouched low, watching me. My heart jumped. I raised my radio and knife, keeping my voice steady. "Come out. I'm a ranger. I'm here to help." No answer. The figure slipped back into the shadows. I felt a cold sweat on my neck. I scanned the area carefully. That's when I noticed the smell. Sharp, metallic. Blood. Not a good sign. I followed the faint trail of blood drops, leading into the thick brush. The undergrowth was tough to push through. Branches grabbed at my jacket, thorns scratched my arms. The light was fading fast. I had to move faster. I kept going, my flashlight ready. Then I saw it, a fallen tree with a dark shape beneath it. I rushed over and saw a man, barely conscious, his face pale and smeared with dirt. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, bleeding badly. I dropped my pack and kneeled beside him. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. I ripped my bandana and tied it tight above the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. His breathing was shallow. I radioed again, desperate. "Station, this is Ranger 7. Found injured male near Stone Creek off trail. Severe leg injury, possible fracture. Need emergency evac ASAP." Static again. I cursed. No way I could carry him out alone in the dark. I had to stay with him, keep him alive until help came. Hours passed. The night cold and silent except for his weak breathing. I stayed alert, hearing every snap of twig, every rustle. Fear settled deep in my chest. Who was he? Why was he here, injured, alone? Had he been followed? I wrapped him in my jacket and kept talking softly, trying to keep him conscious. At dawn, I heard a helicopter's distant thrum. I waved my flashlight frantically. They spotted us. Relief flooded me. The rescue team landed nearby, pulled the man onto a stretcher, and loaded him into the chopper. I followed with them back to the station. Later, in the hospital, I learned the man was a lost hiker, separated from his group, wandering off trail for days, injured in a fall. No foul play, just bad luck and the wild's harsh reality. I thought about the fear I felt, the loneliness, the unknown. But in the end, the forest stayed real, and so did I. That day reminded me how thin the line is between calm and chaos in the wild, and how sometimes the scariest thing is just being alone, lost, with no one around to help but yourself. It was late September, just past the peak of the tourist season in the national forest where I worked. The days were starting to get shorter, and the cold was settling in overnight. I was on a solo patrol, my usual late afternoon to night shift, covering a remote section of the park along a rugged ridge that few visitors ever made it to. I liked this part of the forest best. It was wild and quiet, with steep slopes and thick stands of pine and fir. The only sounds were the wind through the needles and the distant cry of a hawk or an owl starting its evening hunt. I've been out there for a few hours already, hiking along an old fire road that was mostly overgrown. I was checking on a section where a recent storm had brought down a lot of trees and branches, blocking parts of the trail. The forest was full of deadfall and loose rocks, and I had to watch my step carefully. I had my standard gear, headlamp, radio, water, some snacks, a first aid kit, and my binoculars. I was dressed for the cold with layers, a jacket, and a sturdy hat. The wind had picked up. It was a dry wind, the kind that rattles through the branches and dries your throat if you're not careful. I paused on a rise, looking down into the valley below where the sun was dipping behind a distant mountain. The sky was a deep orange, fading to dark blue. It was one of those moments that feels both peaceful and a little empty, like the forest was holding its breath before nightfall. I was about to keep moving when I noticed something odd off to my left, deeper into the trees. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a big rock or a fallen tree trunk. But it shifted slightly, and it didn't look right. I strained my eyes. There was something standing there, tall and still. Too tall for a deer, and not shaped like any animal I'd seen around. It was hard to tell in the fading light. My heart started to beat faster, not out of fear, but out of that sharp alertness you get in the backcountry when something doesn't feel right. I took a slow step forward, moving quietly, scanning with my flashlight beam. The beam caught a flash of movement, a large dark figure, maybe human-sized but hunched a bit. No gear, no reflective clothing. Just standing there, not running away, not hiding. I stayed still and watched. It didn't move again. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else, but it didn't look like an animal. Maybe a hunter or someone lost. We don't usually get trespassers this far back, especially after hours. I tapped my radio. Dispatch, this is Ranger Smith. I'm near the North Ridge, about 2 miles from the main road. I think I've got someone off trail. No gear, no movement. Over. Static was the only answer. Probably too far out. I decided to keep moving toward it, staying on the main path but keeping the flashlight beam steady. The forest was getting darker. The sounds of birds stopped. Even the wind felt quieter. That deep silence you only get when the forest goes fully dark. When I got closer, I could make out the shape better. It was a man, roughly my height, wearing a faded jacket and old jeans. His face was turned away, and I couldn't see much. I called out softly, "Hello? Are you okay?" No response. I stepped closer, my boots crunching on dry pine needles. The man didn't move. When I was about 5 feet away, I saw his hands. They were clenched at his sides, stiff and tense. His head was slightly bowed. I reached out to touch his shoulder, to get his attention, when suddenly he jerked around fast. His eyes were wide, wild, and for a moment I thought he was about to bolt. Instead, he froze again, breathing hard. I could see dirt and scratches on his face, and a long gash on his forehead that was bleeding. This guy was hurt. I stepped back a little and said, "I'm a park ranger. You're safe now. Can you tell me what happened?" Still no answer. I pulled out my radio again, this time using it for an emergency call. "Dispatch, emergency. I found a man injured on the North Ridge Trail. Head wound, possibly lost. Need medical support. Over." This time, I got a faint response. "Copy that. Ranger Smith. Help is en route. Stay with the subject if possible." I pulled my first aid kit out of my pack and quickly tore some gauze. The man's head was bleeding pretty bad, and he was shaking, probably from shock or cold. I cleaned the wound gently and wrapped it the best I could, trying to keep him calm. He still wouldn't speak. I tried to figure out if he was hurt anywhere else. No obvious broken limbs, but he looked weak and dehydrated. As the minutes passed, the sun finally disappeared and the darkness settled in fully. My headlamp was the only source of light, casting long shadows in every direction. The forest felt huge and alive in a way I always felt when I was alone out here, but now it was a little more tense. I kept talking softly to the man, trying to keep him awake. Every now and then, he'd flinch at noises, an animal moving, a branch snapping somewhere nearby. The woods weren't silent anymore. There were low growls and rustles. Bears were waking up, or maybe mountain lions. The thought made my skin crawl, but I had to focus. I scanned the trees, looking for any signs of danger. Nothing but eyes reflecting here and there. The man was breathing more steadily now. I knew we needed to get out of there fast once help arrived. After what felt like an hour, I heard the faint sound of a helicopter in the distance, getting closer. Relief washed over me. I showed my light up, waving, trying to make sure the pilot could see us. When the helicopter landed in a small clearing nearby, a medic jumped out. I briefed him quickly. We loaded the man onto a stretcher, and the helicopter took off into the dark. I was alone again. I started hiking back the way I came. My headlamp was low on batteries. The wind was cold now, sharper. I could feel the fatigue settling in, but I kept moving, keeping to the path. About 10 minutes into my hike back, I noticed something strange near where I had found the man. On the ground was a small backpack, torn open, with some empty food wrappers and a water bottle crushed beside it. That wasn't his bag. The man's pockets were empty except for a folded note. I picked up the note carefully. It was wrinkled and smudged, but I could make out some words. Asterisk lost. Injured. Please help. North Ridge. Asterisk. I looked around carefully, thinking about what I'd seen. This man had been out there alone for who knows how long. No cell phone, no map. The injuries told me he'd been struggling to find his way. As I walked on, I started to put it all together. This wasn't just someone lost in the woods. It was someone who'd been out there long enough to be desperate and scared. Maybe they'd been avoiding people. The wilderness is no place for wandering without preparation. Back at the ranger station, I filed my report and made sure the man was checked in a hospital. The medical staff told me he'd likely make a full recovery, but would need some time. After that night, the memory stuck with me. Out there in the wilderness, when darkness falls, it isn't ghosts or fairies you have to fear. It's the real dangers, the cold, the wild animals, injury, getting lost. A moment's mistake can turn into a fight for survival. As a ranger, I'm trained to help people in those moments. But sometimes, even when help comes, it's a reminder that the forest is a place where you have to respect the rules. Carry your gear, know your route, tell someone where you're going. I don't think about the man often, but I remember that night whenever I'm out on the ridge, watching the sun set and the shadows grow long. It reminds me how quickly things can change in the wild, and how important it is to be ready for anything. That night didn't end with any mystery or supernatural scare. It ended with a man saved because I was there and because he was lucky. But the forest doesn't forgive mistakes. It just waits. And when it's dark and quiet, you can feel that. You have to respect that silence. I want to tell you about one of the worst nights I ever had as a park ranger. It was one of those experiences that stayed with me. Not because something supernatural happened, but because it was so real and so close that I could never forget it. The kind of night where every sound in the forest suddenly feels like a warning, where every shadow seems to stretch and grow, and where you realize how small and alone you really are. I worked as a park ranger in a large national forest in the Pacific Northwest. This place was full of thick trees, Douglas firs, hemlocks, and cedars, towering and dark. The forest floor was covered in moss, ferns, and fallen needles, soft and damp. The air was cool, even in summer, and the smell of earth and pine filled everything. I'd been assigned to patrol a remote area near a winding gravel road that cut through the forest. It wasn't a popular spot for visitors, mostly because there was no real campground or trailhead nearby. It was a place where hikers might stop if they were lost or looking for a shortcut, but otherwise, it was quiet. Dead quiet. That night started like many others. I arrived around 6 p.m. to check on the area, drive the patrol route, and make sure no one was camping illegally or causing trouble. The sun was setting, and the sky was turning dark blue. The forest was peaceful. The only sounds were birds calling as they settled for the night, and the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I had my ranger truck, a flashlight, my radio, and a small first aid kit in my pack. I drove slowly along the gravel road, the tires crunching softly on the loose rocks. I stopped a few times to check places where people had been spotted before, old fire pits, broken branches, footprints. Nothing unusual. The radio was quiet, no calls or alerts. After about an hour, the sun had dipped completely below the horizon, and darkness settled in like a heavy blanket. I pulled the truck over to the side, near a small clearing where I often parked to look around. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out. The beam cut through the dark, lighting up the rough bark of trees and patches of ferns. The air was cool and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. I decided to walk the edge of the clearing, listening. That's when I first noticed something was off. The usual sounds of the forest had stopped. No birds, no insects, no rustling of small animals. The silence felt thick and unnatural. It was the kind of silence that made you hold your breath without realizing it. I stood still, shining the flashlight into the trees. Nothing moved. Then I heard it. A faint, soft sound like someone walking on dry leaves. Not close, but somewhere in the woods to my left. I stopped and waited. The sound stopped too. I moved slowly in the direction of the noise, careful not to make too much noise myself. The forest was dense, but I could see the outlines of big trees and thick bushes. My flashlight bounced over the bark, the leaves on the ground, and the dark shadows between trunks. I moved quietly, the beam scanning left and right. After a few minutes, I saw something I didn't expect. A small campfire, barely burning, surrounded by a few empty cans and a torn backpack. The fire looked old, maybe from earlier that day, but it was strange to see it still warm enough to have smoke rising. I crouched to check. The ashes were warm. Someone had been here very recently. I felt a cold twinge of concern. This was a restricted area, and no camping was allowed. I took out my radio to call in, but before I could press the button, I heard the footsteps again, louder this time, coming closer, but not toward the campfire, off to my right, deeper into the trees. I froze, listening. The footsteps stopped suddenly, like whoever was out there had noticed me. I held my breath, gripping my flashlight tighter. The beam darted through the trees, but I saw nothing. The forest was still, except for my own heavy breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I called into the radio softly, giving my location and the situation. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Kyle. I'm near the east clearing off Gravel Road. Found a warm fire, no sign of people. Hearing footsteps nearby, requesting backup. No answer. The radio was dead quiet. That was strange. Normally, dispatch was quick to respond. I checked the radio again, battery full, volume up. I tried again and again, but nothing. No signal. Now the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I switched off the radio and stuffed in my pack. The silence returned, thick and heavy. The forest felt alive with unseen eyes. I turned back to the fire. I needed to move. Being alone in a place like this, in the dark, with no radio contact, was not good. I made my way slowly back to the truck, flashlights sweeping the path ahead. Then I heard again, the footsteps, faster this time, crunching on leaves and twigs behind me. I didn't stop. I broke into a jog toward the truck, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly as I ran. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My heart pounded in my chest. I could almost feel someone following me through the trees. I reached the truck, threw the door open, and jumped inside. The headlights snapped on, cutting through the dark like spotlights. I locked the doors and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I looked into the rear-view mirror, searching the edge of the forest behind me. At first, I saw nothing. Then, a figure stepped out from the shadows. It was a man, tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. His face was hidden in the shadows, but his eyes caught the light for a moment, sharp, watchful. I swallowed hard. The man didn't move, just stood there, watching me. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I sat in the truck for several minutes, heart racing, trying to calm down. I called dispatch again. This time I got a faint crackle and a voice. They were sending backup immediately. As I waited, I kept my eyes on the forest. The man never came back. The backup arrived about 30 minutes later. Together, we searched the area thoroughly, but we found no signs of anyone else. No footprints beyond the campfire site. No more fires, nothing. The man had vanished without a trace. We filed a report and stayed in the area for the rest of the night. But the silence never fully returned. Every little sound, an owl's call, a branch snapping, felt like a warning. In the weeks that followed, I learned that several hikers had reported seeing a man lurking in that part of the forest, sometimes following people on the trails, disappearing when approached. Local police suspected he might be a drifter or someone hiding out in the woods, possibly dangerous, but they never caught him. I never saw him again. But that night reminded me how wild and unpredictable the forest really is. It's not haunted by ghosts or monsters, but by real people, sometimes lost, sometimes dangerous, who move quietly through the trees. The forest can be beautiful and peaceful, but it can also be a place where you have to be alert and ready for anything. That experience taught me to respect the forest even more, not just the trees and animals, but the unknown people who might be out there, too. It's a reminder that when you're alone in the woods at night, the shadows are not just empty space. They might hide someone watching, waiting, or lost like you. From that day on, I never patrolled alone in that area after dark. And I always made sure my radio worked. Because out there, in the deep forest, the most frightening things aren't stories or legends. They're real. They walk on dry leaves. They watch from the shadows. And you never know when they'll step out into the light. I was working a solo patrol in the backcountry of a large national forest. No cell signal, no backup for miles. It was late September, and the days were starting to shorten. The temperature had dropped noticeably overnight, and the forest smelled of wet earth, pine needles, and decaying leaves. My job was to cover a 15-mile section of rugged trail, winding through dense stands of old-growth Douglas fir and thick underbrush. The trail was narrow and sometimes faint, the kind that hikers rarely used except in small numbers during peak season. This time of year, I usually saw maybe a handful of people, if any, on these stretches. It was quiet, almost too quiet. That day, I'd started early around 7 a.m. I packed my gear tightly, my ranger pack with water, extra layers, a first aid kit, a map, GPS unit, a handheld radio with limited range, and my standard issued 9mm for emergencies. The terrain was steep and rocky in places, with moss-covered logs fallen across the trail. The sound of my boots crunching on dry leaves and broken twigs was the only noise I made as I moved. About 3 miles in, I passed an old, rotting signpost marking a side trail that was closed for the season due to bear activity. The sign was half fallen, leaning awkwardly, and covered in faded orange paint that peeled in the damp air. I noted the spot in my journal to check later for any fresh bear tracks or signs of wildlife conflict. As the morning light moved through the thick canopy, the forest floor shifted from cold shadow to speckled sun patches. Birdsong filled the air, a mixture of jays, thrushes, and woodpeckers. It felt like a living, breathing place, calm and full of quiet life. But there was something off. I can't say exactly what it was at first, just a subtle change in the atmosphere, a feeling I get when something's wrong. Like being watched, though I couldn't see anything or hear more than the usual forest sounds. At around mile 5, the trail crossed a small creek. The water ran clear and cold, rushing over rocks and fallen leaves. I stopped for a moment to drink and check my GPS. The map showed I was on track to reach the next ranger station by late afternoon if I kept moving steadily. I noticed the ground near the creek was disturbed. The mud looked freshly churned. I scanned the area carefully. There were several large footprints, not from any animal I recognized. They were too big and too wide for a deer or elk, and the shape was weird, almost like a boot print, but with no clear tread pattern. The prints headed off trail and into thick brush. I took a mental note and moved on, more alert now. The trail got steeper and rockier as I climbed. The trees thinned out in places, revealing patches of sky through ragged clouds. I stopped for lunch on a fallen log, unpacked my sandwich and some water. I checked my watch. It was just afternoon. I didn't like being out here alone in this part of the forest. The isolation always made me nervous. Not because I feared animals. Grizzlies or mountain lions usually left plenty of signs, and I knew how to avoid them. But because people could be unpredictable. People lost or hurt. People doing things they shouldn't. As I ate, I scanned the ridges and slopes around me. The wind picked up, rustling leaves and shaking branches. Something moved in the distance, a flash of color, maybe a jacket or a pack, but then it was gone. I stood up quickly and called out, "Hello." No reply, just the wind. I shrugged it off as a hiker passing by, but the trail was narrow and I'd heard no footsteps, no voices. I decided to keep moving. The afternoon light faded slowly, and the forest grew darker. By 4 p.m., shadows were deepening, and I still had a few miles to go before the ranger station. My legs were tired, and the rocks made every step tricky. The trail twisted and turned between tall trees, and I kept a close eye on the ground for fresh signs or hazards. Then I heard it, a soft crack like a branch snapping under weight off the trail to my right. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, quieter this time. I glanced toward the noise and saw nothing but thick brush and trees. Still, something didn't feel right. I raised my radio to call the station. "Station, this is Ranger Mike. I'm near mile 7. Not seeing anyone, but I heard something off trail." "Over." Static. No response. I tried again. Silence. I didn't panic, but knot tightened in my stomach. I switched my radio to emergency frequency and called out again. Nothing. I put the radio away and moved slowly forward, keeping my eyes on the thick brush. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of something moving quickly behind the trees, about 20 yards away. It was a person, but their movements were strange, jerky, like they were hiding or trying to avoid being seen. They ducked behind a tree and disappeared. I raised my 9mm and shouted, "Hey, show yourself." No answer. I took a few careful steps toward where I'd seen the movement, scanning the brush. My pulse was quickening. I wasn't sure if it was a lost hiker or someone else. But out here, alone, anyone acting like that was cause for concern. I started walking parallel to the trail, edging toward the spot where the person had vanished. Then I saw it, an abandoned backpack, lying half-hidden under a fallen log. I approached cautiously. The pack was open, and inside were scattered items: an empty water bottle, a crumpled snack wrapper, and a torn map of the area. No ID, no phone. It looked like whoever left it had disappeared in a hurry. A chill ran through me. I checked the immediate area for tracks. The dirt was soft here, and there were footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot. They led away from the trail, heading downhill toward a dense thicket of bushes and deadfall. I debated what to do. I didn't want to chase blindly into thick brush alone, but I also couldn't leave someone possibly in trouble. I radioed again, voice low, "Station, Ranger Mike here. Found abandoned pack near mile 7. No sign of owner. Footprints lead off trail downhill. Requesting backup. Over." Still no response. The silence over the radio was heavy. I took a deep breath and decided to follow the tracks carefully, staying alert. The ground grew slippery with wet leaves and moss as I moved downhill. The footprints became muddier, more spaced out. The forest thickened until it was almost impossible to see far ahead. I moved slowly, using my flashlight as the sun dipped below the horizon. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept reminding myself, this is just someone lost or scared. After about 15 minutes, the footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing. The clearing was about 30 feet wide, surrounded by thick bushes and trees. I stepped into it and scanned the area. There was nothing obvious, but then I saw it. A small pile of broken branches and leaves in the center of the clearing, arranged almost like a crude shelter or bedding. It looked fresh, maybe from that morning or the day before. I searched the edges of the clearing and found a small patch of disturbed earth, flattened grass, and some blood. Not a lot, but enough to tell me someone had been hurt. My heart hammered. I called out softly, "Hey, are you here?" No answer. I took out my first aid kit and checked the blood for clues. The blood was dark red, and some was smeared on a nearby rock. I knew I needed to get help. I headed back up toward the trail, moving quickly but carefully. At the trail, I paused, looking at the last light fading. The radio crackled faintly. "Ranger Mike, this is Station. Copy your last message. Backup is en route. ETA 30 minutes. Relief mixed with worry." 30 minutes alone out here felt too long. I stayed on the trail and began a slow patrol back toward the ranger station, eyes peeled. Then I heard again, a rustle, close and deliberate. I spun around, gun raised. No one, but the feeling of being watched was stronger. I called out one last time before dark. "If you need help, stay where you are. We're coming." The backup arrived just after dark. Together, we returned to the clearing and found more evidence of a struggle. Scrapes on trees, broken branches, and more blood. We tracked the footprints leading deeper into the forest, but lost the trail after half a mile. A search party was organized the next day, combing the area carefully. They found signs of the person, but no one. Theories were shared: lost hiker, injured, maybe moving to get help. Days later, a local hunter found a damaged backpack near a river several miles away, with supplies inside and a note. The note said only "help." That's all. We never found the person. But the feeling I had out there, the isolation, the unknown, never left me. The forest is beautiful and wild, but it's also unforgiving. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't ghosts or monsters. They're just the real dangers we can't control. The ones that remind you how small and alone you really are out there. I was already halfway through my shift when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like something burning, but not wood or leaves. It was harder to place, something acrid and sharp. I was on patrol near the Ridge Trail, a narrow path cut through thick evergreens and rocky outcrops. where the pine trees crowd the sky and block out the sun in places. The forest floor here was thick with pine needles and moss, soft and damp underfoot. Early October had started cold, but today the air was heavy, sticky with humidity that didn't quite fit. I stopped and sniffed again, trying to catch the scent better. Smoke, definitely smoke, but not fresh campfire smoke. This was different. It reminded me of burning rubber or plastic. I frowned, scanning the horizon. From a ridge, you can see the valley below, a patchwork of old logging roads, abandoned cabins, and thick woods stretching for miles. I couldn't see any smoke plumes, just the low-hanging haze in the air. I checked my radio. No reports of fires or control burns. The fire tower was quiet. Still, I decided to head down the trail towards the source of the smell. The ranger station was about 3 miles from here, but I wasn't going back yet. Something was off. The trail narrowed as I descended, the tall pines giving way to a mix of hardwoods and scrub. Leaves were starting to turn, yellows and reds bright against the dark bark. Underfoot, the trail was littered with small branches and cones, showing little sign of recent use. It was late afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows through the trees. As I moved down, I noticed signs of disturbance, fresh tire tracks in the mud where a four-wheel drive had passed recently. Strange, since that part of the forest was closed to vehicles. I stopped to examine the tracks. The tires were wide, made for off-road, but the mud was fresh, maybe a few hours old. Whoever was here wasn't supposed to be. I pocketed my radio and pulled out my flashlight just in case. The light was weak in the growing dusk, but it helped pick out details in the underbrush. I kept moving slowly, alert. The smell grew stronger, sharp and unpleasant, cutting through the damp forest air. After about 10 minutes, I came to a small clearing. It was roughly circular, about 30 feet across, ringed by young pines and brambles. In the middle was a smoldering pile of trash, old plastic containers, cans, bits of cloth, and what looked like scraps of rubber. The fire was nearly out, just embers glowing dim red. The air was thick with smoke, choking and bitter. This wasn't a natural fire. Someone had been here recently and burned their trash illegally, probably to avoid packing it out. I felt a familiar mix of frustration and concern. Illegal dumping was common in remote parts of the park, but burning trash was dangerous. It could easily start a wildfire, especially this time of year when the forest was dry in spots. I took pictures of the site with my phone, then pulled out a small plastic evidence bag from my pack. I collected a few bits of the burned material, careful not to touch anything sharp or dangerous. The pile looked like it had been deliberately hidden, surrounded by branches and rocks to keep it contained. Whoever did this didn't want to be seen. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint rustle behind me, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze, listening. The forest was quiet again, the only sounds the wind in the trees and the distant call of a jay. Still, I knew better than to dismiss the noise. I reached slowly for my pepper spray on my belt, a habit drilled into me after years working alone. The rustling stopped. I waited, eyes scanning the shadows. Nothing moved. I started back up the trail, quickening my pace. The sun was lower now, and the forest was darkening fast. My flashlight was on, a steady beam cutting through the gloom. I stayed alert, ears straining for any sign of trouble. When I reached the main trailhead, my radio crackled. The dispatcher's voice was calm, routine, but I felt a knot in my stomach. "Ranger, we've had a report of a missing hiker near Bear Creek. Last seen this afternoon." I frowned. Bear Creek was about 5 miles from where I was now, a remote area with steep banks and dense undergrowth. I knew that trail well. It was popular with experienced hikers, but tricky to navigate. I keyed the mic, copy that. "I'm near the Ridge Trail, heading to the station now. I'll check in on Bear Creek after." The dispatcher acknowledged, then went quiet. I left the clearing behind and pushed on towards the station. The forest grew darker, shadows merging into thick blackness beneath the trees. I kept my flashlight steady, the beam bouncing from tree trunk to tree trunk. When I got back to the station, I grabbed my maps and gear. I had to find that hiker. The clock was ticking. I set off towards Bear Creek, following the old logging road that ran parallel to the creek. The road was rough and overgrown, with fallen branches and patches of mud. I walked fast but steady, knowing the terrain and the risks. The creek itself was low, its banks steep and muddy. I scanned the area carefully, looking for signs, footprints, dropped gear, broken branches. The afternoon shadows lengthened, making it harder to see. About 2 miles in, I spotted something near the water's edge, an abandoned backpack, half hidden under a fallen log. It was battered and dirty, the straps frayed. I knelt to inspect it. Inside, I found a water bottle, some snacks, and a map folded badly. No sign of the owner. I radioed in the find and started a systematic search along the creek, moving upstream and downstream. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and insects absent. Even the wind seemed to have died down. As the sky faded from orange to deep blue, I knew I had to act fast. I marked the spots where I found the backpack and tracks, then moved towards a narrow side trail leading into thicker woods. The trail was faint, barely visible under fallen leaves. After an hour, I found a shallow depression in the ground, disturbed earth and flattened leaves. It looked like someone had rested there recently. Nearby, I found a broken walking stick and a crumpled jacket caught on a branch. I took a deep breath and radioed the coordinates back to the station, requesting backup. The area was remote and rugged, and night was falling fast. I settled in to wait for help, setting up a small campfire and preparing for a long night. My flashlight scanned the trees constantly, alert for any movement. Hours passed. The forest around me was alive with small sounds, crickets chirping, owls calling, but no sign of the missing hiker. I paced the perimeter, feeling the weight of isolation pressing down. At dawn, I heard a faint noise, a cough, then a groan from the direction of the creek. I moved quickly towards the sound, heart pounding. There, wedged between 2 rocks in a narrow ravine, was the hiker. A middle-aged man, pale and shivering, but alive. He had slipped on the wet rocks and twisted his ankle badly. He'd been trying to make his way back when he got stuck. I radioed for medical aid and stayed with him, wrapping him in my jacket and offering water. He was weak, exhausted, but coherent. The rescue team arrived by mid-morning, and we helped carry him out on a stretcher. The relief was overwhelming. No fancy heroics, just steady work and luck. Back at the station, I reported everything. The illegal fire, the strange tire tracks, the missing hiker's ordeal. The forest had tested me that night, showing how fragile we all are out here, how easy it is to get lost or hurt. But it also reminded me why I do this job. Because every life matters in this wild place, and because the forest doesn't forgive mistakes. I went home tired, sore, but grateful. The forest had kept its secrets, but not its dangers. And I was ready for the next shift. The sun had just slipped behind the ridge when I pulled into the small parking area near the old fire lookout tower. It was late October, the trees around me a patchwork of burnt orange, dull gold, and dark green. The wind was cold, sharp against my face, and I was glad I wore my heavy jacket. My shift was supposed to end at dusk, but I'd volunteered to stay late for a few hours. Something about this place made me want to keep watch longer. The quiet, the way the forest changed in the dark, and the steady hum of the wilderness settling in for the night. I've been a park ranger for nearly 5 years now. The routines, the patrols, the paperwork, all of it familiar. But nights like this reminded me why I love the job. Out here, the forest felt alive in a way it didn't during the day. The crackle of dry leaves underfoot, the sudden sharp call of a distant bird, the way the shadows stretched like fingers across the dirt road. It kept me alert. I grabbed my flashlight from the dash, checked my radio, and stepped out into the cool air. The parking lot was empty except for my truck. Not a soul in sight. I started walking the trail toward the lookout tower, the beam from my flashlight slicing through the dark like a knife. The dirt path was rough under my boots, scattered with pine needles and small stones. I noticed fresh deer tracks nearby, and the faint, almost sweet smell of damp earth and moss filled my nose. The forest was quiet but not silent. Somewhere, an owl hooted and the distant rustling of small animals echoed through the trees. I reached the base of the lookout tower and paused, shining my light upward. The metal frame was old, rusted in places, but sturdy. The glassed-in cabin at the top looked empty, though I knew it was still in use during fire season. Tonight, it was just me and the woods. The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead. I tightened my jacket collar and climbed the narrow metal stairs carefully. At the top, I opened the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood, grease, and worn leather. I flicked on the lantern inside and set it on the small table next to the window. From here, I could see the entire valley below, bathed in the dim light of a half-moon rising over the horizon. I pulled out my radio and checked in with the ranger station. The voice crackled back with the usual calm. "All clear here. Quiet night so far." I settled into the creaky wooden chair and scanned the horizon with my binoculars. The forest stretched endlessly, a sea of dark shapes broken by the faint glimmer of a distant creek. I let my eyes wander, trying to spot any signs of trouble, smoke, fire, people. After a while, I started to relax. The cold didn't seem so biting now, and the silence felt less like emptiness and more like a blanket. My mind drifted, thinking about the day's patrols, the hikers I'd met, the kids on the school trip, the careless campers who'd left trash behind. Suddenly, something moved. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow shifting in the wind. But then, there was again a flicker of motion low on the far side of the ridge near the river bend. A small campfire's faint orange glow. That was strange. This time of year, the park was mostly empty. Fire danger was low, and campfires were only allowed in designated sites, all accounted for in the ranger station logs. No one was supposed to be out there tonight. I grabbed my radio, ready to call it in, but hesitated. Maybe it was just a hunter or a night fisherman. I flipped on the flashlight and scanned the area below. The glow was steady, small, and bright against the dark trees. I grabbed my gear, my flashlight, radio, a pocket knife, and a map, and headed down the tower stairs. The metal steps creaked beneath my weight, and I tried to be quiet. The wind had died down a bit, and the forest felt colder, heavier somehow. Back at the parking lot, I loaded my flashlight into my hand and started down the trail toward the fire glow. The trees grew thicker here, the dirt path narrower and more uneven. My breath came out in white clouds, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. But there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves and my own footsteps. The glow was clearer now, a steady campfire burning low. I moved closer, careful to stay hidden behind trees and bushes. My radio was off. I didn't want to alert whoever was there before I had a clear picture. I crept up to the edge of a small clearing and froze. There were 3 people sitting around the fire. They looked like hunters or campers, dressed in dark clothes, with heavy backpacks and hunting rifles leaned against nearby trees. Their faces were turned away from me, but I could see the outline of their shapes in the firelight. Something felt wrong. First, they were not in a designated campsite. Second, it was late and they had no permits displayed anywhere. Third, one of them was fiddling with a small device, a GPS or radio. Maybe, I couldn't be sure. I tapped the radio lightly and whispered my location to the station, telling them I'd found unauthorized campers. Suddenly, a loud snap, like a branch breaking, sounded behind me. I whipped my head around, shining the flashlight wildly. Nothing, just the trees and the dark. My heart kicked up. I took a deep breath and reminded myself to stay calm. No reason to panic. I turned back to the fire, but the campers were gone. No sign of them. No fire. No backpacks. Nothing but smoldering ashes and scattered leaves. I frowned and crouched to examine the fire pit. The fire had clearly been there recently, but no longer than a few minutes. The ashes were still warm. I scanned the woods around me carefully. Tracks? Signs of movement? Nothing obvious. The woods were silent now, except for the sound of my own breathing. I thought about calling for backup, but the radio was dead. The signal was gone, cut off by the deep canyon walls and thick trees. I tried again, tapping frantically, but no response. The radio was useless. I was alone. I took a deep breath, told myself it was probably a trick of the light or someone moving quickly away. Still, I needed to find those people. They could be poachers or worse. I started moving back along the trail, flashlight scanning every shadow. Then I heard it, a faint, shuffling sound off to my right. It was soft but deliberate, like someone stepping quietly, maybe trying to avoid detection. I stopped, listened. The sound stopped. I took another step forward. The shuffling started again, this time closer. My heart hammered. I gripped my flashlight tighter. I swung it toward the noise. For a moment, I saw movement, a figure darting between the trees. Too fast to make out, but definitely human. I called out quietly, "Park Ranger. Identify yourself." No answer. I started moving toward the figure, careful to stay quiet. Suddenly, the figure broke into a run, disappearing deeper into the forest. I followed, but the trail was confusing now. Twisted paths, fallen logs, thick brush. I tried to keep up, but my legs were tired and my lungs burned in the cold air. After a while, the figure vanished completely. I stopped, frustrated and breathless. I checked my watch. Over an hour had passed since I left the tower. I was lost. The forest looked different in the dark, unfamiliar, even though I'd patrolled it dozens of times. My flashlight flickered. I tapped it, shook it. The battery was dying. I cursed under my breath. No radio, no signal, dying flashlight, and a thick forest I barely recognized. I forced myself to stay calm. I found a fallen log and sat down, pulling out my backup battery from my jacket. I replaced the flashlight battery and turned it back on. The beam was dim but steady. I looked around, trying to find a landmark. I spotted the glow of the lookout tower's lantern on the distant ridge, faint but there. I grabbed my map and compass. Using the compass, I figured my direction and started walking uphill toward the tower. The forest was eerie. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker. I kept my flashlight beam sweeping constantly, alert for any movement. After what felt like hours but was probably just 45 minutes, I finally reached the clearing at the tower base. I climbed the stairs slowly, the metal cold against my gloves. Inside the cabin, I checked the radio again. The signal was back. I called the station. "Base, this is Ranger Thompson. I'm back at the tower. Lost the signal and flashlight, but safe. No sign of unauthorized campers or poachers. We'll keep watch through the night." The voice came back calm, relieved. I leaned against the window, staring out over the dark forest below. I thought about the strange campfire, the runners in the woods, the silence that followed. No one would believe me if I told them how quickly the campers disappeared or how the radio cut out at the worst moment. But I knew what I'd seen. People were out here, hiding, probably poachers or hunters trying to avoid the law. I made a mental note to alert the rangers on the morning shift, to search the area carefully. For now, all I could do was wait. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 7 years now, mostly in remote sections of the National Forest where cell service is a joke and you have to rely on your own two eyes to keep things running smooth. That's where I'm happiest, out in the woods, away from the noise of visitors, out where the land is wild and the only company you get is the wind, the trees, and the animals. That particular summer, I was assigned to a night patrol shift in a rarely visited part of the park. The area was a rugged stretch of mixed pine and hardwood, with steep ridges and a slow-moving river carving its way through the valley. Trails were few and rough. This part of the forest was popular with a handful of hunters in the fall, but generally quiet the rest of the year. My job was to check on trail conditions, look for any illegal activity, and make sure campers were following the rules. The night started calm. I left the ranger station right before sunset, my truck bouncing over gravel roads, tires kicking up dust that settled on the dark green canopy below. I had my gear packed tightly, flashlight, radio, a small first aid kit, a map, a GPS unit, and a sidearm for safety. I always made sure to carry water and snacks, because you never know how long a patrol might take. My boots crunched against the dirt as I stepped onto the trailhead, the fading light turning the sky a deep blue. The forest was quiet but alive with the subtle sounds of nature settling in for the night. Crickets chirped steadily. The distant hoot of an owl echoed between the trees, and the river whispered over stones nearby. I kept my flashlight off at first, trusting my night vision, but after a few hundred yards, the darkness became too thick, and I flicked the beam on, cutting a path through the shadows. I had walked this trail a dozen times before during the day, but the night changed everything. The trees looked taller, the shadows deeper, and every noise sounded sharper, more deliberate. I stopped several times to listen. A twig snapping under a small animal's foot, the rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted up a branch, a gust of wind pushing dead leaves across the path. About 2 miles in, the trail crossed a narrow wooden bridge over a creek. The bridge looked old but sturdy, made from thick logs and planks worn smooth by years of rain and foot traffic. I paused to check the structure, tapping the planks with my boot. They were solid. I could see the water below, dark and fast, reflecting the moonlight through the branches overhead. As I crossed, I caught sight of something unusual on the far side, a faint glint near the bushes at the trail's edge. I stopped and shone my flashlight toward it. At first, I thought it was a piece of trash left behind, but the shape was off. It looked like a small, metal object half buried under leaves. I moved closer and crouched down. It was a discarded hunting knife, the blade still sharp, the handle scratched and dirty. Someone had left it here recently. That wasn't normal, especially not in a spot so close to the trail. I bagged the knife carefully in a plastic evidence bag from my pack, noting the location on my GPS. It might be nothing, but I filed it away in my mind as something to check later. Moving on, I kept an eye out for other signs. There were no campsites nearby, no fires, no fresh footprints, just the deep silence of the woods around me. I felt a strange stillness settle in, the kind that tells you something's off, even if you can't put your finger on it. I reached a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by thick brush and tall trees. This spot had a fire ring, but it hadn't been used for some time. I scanned the area, sweeping my flashlight slowly from side to side. Then I heard it, a faint noise, almost like breathing, or maybe the quiet shifting of someone crouched in the bushes. I froze. The beam of my flashlight stopped on a patch of dark leaves, where a pair of eyes caught the light briefly and vanished. My heart kicked up a notch, but I kept calm. Illegal hunters sometimes hid to avoid being caught. Could be that. I called in a report on the radio, just a short note about possible trespassers in the area. No response yet. My radio was spotty, but it usually worked in patches. I decided to move closer to the edge of the clearing, trying to see if anyone was hiding. My boots sank slightly into damp soil. The night air felt thick, and my breath came out in small clouds. My flashlight beam caught on a set of fresh footprints leading away from the clearing, heading deeper into the forest. I followed. The trail was narrow and overgrown here. Branches scraped my arms and face as I pushed through. The footprints led down a slope toward the river, disappearing at the water's edge. The ground was muddy, and I could see marks where someone had stepped into the shallow water. The sound of the river grew louder. The moon was high now, but the trees blocked much of its light. The forest felt tighter, as if closing in around me. Suddenly, my foot slipped on wet rocks near the bank. I caught myself just in time, heart pounding from surprise. I crouched to steady my footing, shining the light along the water's edge. Then I saw it. A piece of torn cloth caught on a jagged branch, bright orange against the dark green moss. Orange hunting gear. Someone had been here recently, for sure. I scanned the riverbank up and down. No sign of anyone now. The silence was complete, except for the steady rush of water. I radioed again, warning dispatch about the footprints and the knife. Still no reply. I decided to head back toward the truck. I didn't like the feeling of being alone in a place like this with something unknown lurking. But as I turned, my flashlight caught a movement. A deer? No, too large, too slow. A man stepped out from behind a tree, wearing a faded orange jacket, face covered with dirt and scratches. He held a rifle loosely at his side, eyes wild and wary. I called out, but he vanished back into the trees before I could get closer. I knew then the guy wasn't just hunting. Something wasn't right. My skin prickled with the kind of fear that's not from ghosts or monsters, but from real danger. This was a man who didn't want to be found. I hurried back the way I came, constantly checking over my shoulder. The trail was slippery, the underbrush thick, and the dark seemed to press in closer with every step. When I finally reached my truck, relief washed over me like cold water. I locked the doors and called for backup. Within the hour, other rangers arrived, combing the area, but found nothing. No footprints, no fire, no sign of the man or any other trespassers. We left notes and traps, checked the area over the next few nights. Nothing. Weeks later, during a routine patrol, I found the knife again. It was placed carefully on a flat rock near the bridge. No leaves, no dirt. Like a message. I don't know if the guy was trying to scare me, or warn me, or just play games. But I never saw him again. The forest had kept its secret, silent and waiting. From then on, I always patrolled with a partner in that section, never alone. The woods felt different, not because of ghosts or fairy tales, but because of real people and real danger that hide behind the trees, unseen but always present. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 8 years now. Most days are routine, checking trails, making sure people follow the rules, rescuing lost hikers, or inspecting campsites. But every once in a while, something happens that sticks with you. This is one of those stories. It was late October, the kind of cold that bites through your jacket and settles in your bones. The forest was starting to turn, reds and yellows mixing with browns and grays as leaves fell to the ground. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. My shift started just before dawn. I was assigned to patrol the northern section of the park that day, a mostly quiet area with few visitors this time of year. I loaded up my gear, flashlight, radio, GPS, extra batteries, first aid kit, my hunting knife strapped to my belt. The truck rumbled through the dirt roads as I headed into the thick woods. The sun barely peeked over the horizon when I parked near a trailhead called Pine Ridge. It was one of the more rugged areas, steep hills, dense brush, and rocky outcrops. Not many people came here, especially this late in the season. I stepped out, the cold hit me immediately. The ground was wet, crunching under my boots. I started my usual patrol, checking the trail markers, looking for signs of any problems, broken branches, litter, or illegal campfires. As I walked, I could hear the quiet sounds of the forest waking up. A bird calling somewhere high above, leaves rustling in a soft breeze, the distant drip of water from the trees. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. Along the side of the trail, near a bend, there were fresh footprints. They were big, heavy, not human. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were too big for a man's boot, and the spacing between steps was too wide. Bear prints? Possibly, but I've been around bears enough to know those prints didn't look right. They were deeper, heavier, like something bigger was moving through the forest. Something unusual. I checked my GPS to mark the spot and snapped a photo to send to dispatch later. I figured it might just be a large male bear passing through. Nothing more to it. I continued on. The trail climbed steeply here, the trees thickening around me. The light was still low. The forest was quiet, but for the sounds of my own footsteps and breathing. I made my way to a small clearing I knew about, a favorite spot for hikers to rest, and looked around for signs of recent human activity. That's when I saw it. A makeshift camp. It was crude. Some branches leaned against a tree, a few rocks arranged in a circle that looked like a fire pit. The ground was disturbed, and the smell of smoke still lingered faintly. No trash, no footprints beyond the big ones I saw earlier. No tents, no signs of a person, just a fire pit and a shelter. I radioed dispatch. Base, this is Ranger Morgan. Found a small camp in Pine Ridge clearing. No people around. Possible transient? Over. Static. Then a quick response. Copy that. Ranger Morgan. Proceed with caution. I took a closer look. The fire pit had a few burnt logs, still warm to the touch, but no flames. It must have been used recently. maybe within the last 12 hours. I scanned the area, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in. I started back toward the trail when I heard it, a low, guttural sound. Not quite a growl, but something animalistic. I froze. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The sound came again. It was close, maybe 50 yards to my left, just beyond the trees. I trained my flashlight into the shadows, scanning slowly. Nothing. No movement. Just trees and darkness. I reached for my radio again. Base. I'm hearing something unusual near my position. Could be an animal, but sounds off. Over. Copy Morgan. Stay alert. We're sending backup to your location. Over. I nodded, even though no one could see me. The sound came again, louder this time, a deep growl mixed with a strange snuffling. It wasn't a normal bear sound. I worked around bears, wolves, and mountain lions. This wasn't any of them. It was something heavier, slower. My heart rate picked up. I gripped my flashlight tighter and moved carefully back toward the truck, eyes darting to the trees on either side of the trail. The forest felt alive, watching me. I didn't want to run. Running in this terrain meant tripping or twisting an ankle. I had to stay calm and keep moving steadily. When I finally reached the truck, I jumped inside, locked the doors, and called for backup again. The radio crackled. Backup is 10 minutes out. Hold your position. I sat there, flashlight trained on the edge of the tree line. The growls fading, but never completely gone. Minutes stretched. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate, on the dirt road behind the truck. I looked out the window, but couldn't see anything. The headlights illuminated the thick woods, but nothing moved. No animals fled. No birds took flight. The footsteps stopped near the truck. My breath caught. I grabbed my radio and flashlight, ready to defend myself if needed. Then, the truck door handle rattled. Someone or something was trying to open it. I slammed the door lock. The handle rattled again, harder this time, like whatever was outside was trying to force its way in. Panic hit me. I started the engine, shifting into reverse. The handle stopped moving. I didn't wait to find out why. I floored the gas, tires spinning, throwing dirt and leaves behind me as I backed out onto the main dirt road. The growling started again from the trees, fading as I drove away. I called dispatch. I'm out. Something tried to get in the truck. I'm heading to base. Request immediate backup. Over. Minutes later, 2 other rangers arrived. We went back to the clearing with them, but the campfire was gone. No footprints anywhere. It was like the place had never existed. I reported everything in detail to my supervisor. They took the incident seriously, but chalked it up to a bear or some big animal behaving strangely. But I knew better. Over the next few days, more reports came in about strange noises in the northern section. Heavy footsteps, deep growls, things moving just beyond sight. No injuries, no direct encounters, just a feeling of something watching. I kept patrolling that area, always alert. One evening, as the sun was setting, I found fresh prints again, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen. They led to a steep ravine where no trail went. I stayed back, watching. From the shadows, I saw a massive shape move, heavy, muscular, but covered in thick fur. It moved slower than any animal I knew. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a cougar. It was something else. I snapped pictures but kept my distance. Over time, I realized this creature was avoiding humans, watching from a distance, rarely crossing trails, but always close enough to be felt. I never saw it up close again, but the knowledge stayed with me. The forest had something in it, something large and wild, hidden but very real. And I learned that not all dangers come with sharp claws or teeth. Sometimes the scariest thing is the unknown, the silent watcher in the dark. I stayed on that patrol for the rest of the season, more cautious, more aware. The park's visitors never saw or heard anything strange, but I did. And now, whenever I walk those trails, I remember the cold air, the heavy prints, the low growls in the dark, and the feeling that the wilderness holds secrets even the longest-serving rangers can't fully understand. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 10 years now. Over the course of those years, I've spent countless nights alone in the backcountry, patrolling trails, checking on campsites, and keeping an eye out for anything that doesn't belong. I'm used to solitude and the sounds of the forest at night. The creaks, the rustles, the distant calls of animals. But there was one night, not too long ago, that unsettled me more than anything else I've ever experienced. It started out like any other shift. I was working in a large national forest out west. The park covers hundreds of square miles, thick with pine and fir trees, deep valleys, and winding rivers. This forest is the kind that feels alive, full of ancient trees that have stood for hundreds of years and animals that rarely see humans. That evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I finished my patrol of the main campground. I checked the fire pits, made sure no one was breaking any rules, and gave the forest a good look as the last campers packed up to leave. The sky was a clear, deep blue, the air was cool, and the smell of pine needles and damp earth was strong. It felt peaceful. After that, I drove my ranger truck down a dirt road leading to a remote backcountry trailhead. My plan was to hike in a few miles and check a remote ranger cabin that hadn't been used in a while. It was an old structure built decades ago to give rangers shelter on long patrols. The cabin was on a ridge overlooking a small creek, tucked away in a thick stand of trees. By the time I parked and started my hike, the last light was fading fast. I had my headlamp, some extra batteries, a GPS, a radio, and the usual gear. I like hiking alone. It gives me time to think, and I know the forest better than most. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, but still marked well enough. The dirt was soft underfoot, covered in fallen pine needles. The forest around me was darkening quickly. The thick canopy above blocked out most of the remaining light, and the shadows deepened. As I walked, I listened closely. The usual night sounds were starting. The chirps of crickets, the hoot of an owl far off, the soft rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The scent of wet moss and decaying leaves was strong. The air was cold, but not freezing. I breathed deeply. About halfway to the cabin, I noticed something unusual. The trail, which I knew well, had some fresh footprints in the soft dirt. They were big, probably a man's boots, and they looked recent, maybe only a few hours old. I stopped and knelt down to examine them. The prints led off the trail, down a slight slope into thicker trees. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but didn't see anything unusual. No trash, no broken branches, no signs of a campsite or fire. It was just footprints disappearing into the undergrowth. Normally, this wouldn't bother me. People hike back here sometimes, but the prints seemed out of place. I shrugged it off and kept going, reminding myself I was on patrol and stay focused. As I neared the cabin, the forest grew darker, the trees denser. The trail wound up a small hill, and when I reached the ridge, I could hear the creek below, a soft, steady rush of water over rocks. The cabin was exactly as I remembered it, small, wooden, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. The windows were dirty, but the door was locked tight. I checked the structure for damage or signs of use. Nothing seemed amiss. No footprints or tracks around it, no garbage, no evidence anyone had been there. I jotted notes in my logbook and took a few pictures to send to the office later. The plan was to stay until morning, keep an eye on the area, and then hike back. I set up a small campfire a little way from the cabin, just enough to keep warm. The dry wood crackled, and the firelight flickered over the nearby trees. I ate a quick meal, sipped some water, and settled in. Around midnight, things started to feel different. The wind picked up, but it was strange, quiet at first, just a gentle rustle, then stronger gusts that shook the branches above. The trees creaked and groaned like old bones. I scanned the dark woods with my flashlight, but all I saw were moving shadows. That's when I heard the first noise. It wasn't an animal. It was a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. Then another and another. It came from down the slope near the trail, the same direction the footprints had gone earlier. I froze. My mind raced. Could it be a bear? Or a deer? Maybe a tree branch falling? I listened carefully. The thuds were spaced apart, slow and deliberate, not like random noise. I grabbed my radio and tried calling base, but only static came back. The weather here was rough, and the ridge blocked most signals. I wasn't worried yet, but but made a note to try again. I packed up the fire and got my flashlight ready. Slowly, I started walking down the slope toward the sounds. The forest was dense and dark, shadows moving in the beam of my light. The air smelled damp and earthy. The thuds continued, louder now, like something big and heavy moving through the underbrush. As I moved closer, I realized the noise was coming from near the creek where the water rushed over rocks. The creek itself was narrow and fast, the banks steep and slippery with mud. I followed the trail of noises carefully, my boots sinking into wet leaves and dirt. Then I saw it. Near the water's edge, partially hidden by brush, was an overturned backpack, torn and dirty. Nearby, a broken trekking pole lay on the ground. There were fresh footprints all around, but these were smaller than the ones I'd seen before, lighter boots, maybe a woman's. My heart picked up. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite or lost gear. Someone had been here recently, and they might be in trouble. I called again on the radio, more urgently this time. Still no answer. I searched the area, calling out softly. The forest swallowed my voice. The thuds had stopped. That's when I noticed something else. Footprints leading away from the creek, heading back up the hill toward the cabin, but not on the trail. They veered through the trees, crossing thick roots and low branches. I followed them, moving as quietly as possible. After a few hundred yards, the print stopped suddenly near a large fallen tree. I circled around it, shining my light through the dense brush. Then I found it, footprints pressed deep in the soft mud, some smeared as if someone had slipped or fallen. And then, a patch of disturbed ground with what looked like a small bloodstain on a rock. I stopped. The blood was dark, dry but fresh enough to be alarming. I pulled out my gloves and carefully examined the area. There were small bits of torn fabric caught on a branch, the same color as the backpack. This was serious. I radioed again, this time on the emergency channel. Finally, I heard a crackled reply. Base to Ranger. Repeat your position and situation. I gave my exact coordinates and explained what I'd found. They told me to stay put, that a search team was being sent, but I couldn't stay still. Something about the silence was suffocating. I had to keep moving. I backtracked to the trailhead, hoping to meet the team halfway. As I walked, the forest felt different, heavier, like it was watching me. My flashlight's beam flickered. The wind shifted, carrying faint sounds of breaking branches, like someone moving just out of sight. I kept my eyes peeled, every nerve alert. When I finally reached the truck, I was soaked in sweat despite the cold. I locked the doors and called base again to update them. They said the team would be there soon. Minutes later, headlights appeared on the dirt road. Relief washed over me. The search team spread out with flashlights and radios. I guided them back to the creek and showed them the evidence. They found more footprints and bloodstains, but no sign of the person. The forest was too thick, too vast to cover quickly. We worked all night, calling for the missing hiker, checking nearby streams and hollows, but there was no response. By dawn, we had to call off the search until daylight. I sat in the truck, staring at the rising sun, thinking about the person who had left that backpack, who had been hurt somewhere in that forest. I felt a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away. The next day, with more rangers and a search dog, we went back in. The dog picked up a scent near the creek and led us deeper into the woods. After hours, we found her, exhausted, cold, and weak, hiding in a small hollow under a fallen tree. She had sprained her ankle and was unable to walk. She hadn't spoken much, just nodded when we offered help. We got her out safely. Later, I learned she had gotten lost after trying to explore an old mining trail that wasn't marked on any maps. She had been hiking alone without proper gear. That night in the forest had felt like a nightmare, but it ended well because I stayed calm, stayed alert, and kept moving. Sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't a monster or ghost. It's the real danger of getting lost, injured, and alone in a vast, wild place. It's the silence that swallows you whole and the fear of not being found. That night reminded me why I became a ranger, to protect people and to be the one who searches when others disappear. I never forgot the feeling of those footsteps in the dark. I never thought a normal day in the park could turn into something that would stick with me for years. I've worked as a park ranger for almost a decade, mostly in dense, wild forests where you have to keep your eyes open all the time. Most days are quiet. People come and go, hike the trails, fish, camp, or just pass through. But sometimes the forest has its own plans. It was late October, the kind of day when the cold air settles in the bones, but the sun still shines bright. The leaves were mostly gone from the tall oaks and maples. The ground was a mix of damp dirt and frozen patches from the night before. I was on patrol alone, driving my old 4x4 down a narrow dirt road deep in the park. This road wasn't often traveled, just a rough track used by forest workers and rangers. It wound through thick woods, where sunlight barely reached the ground in some places. My job was to check the trails, the backcountry campsites, and the old logging roads to make sure everything was safe. I carried my standard gear, a radio, a flashlight, a first aid kit, my rifle for emergencies, and a big knife strapped to my belt. The forest felt alive with the sound of dry leaves crunching under my boots, the distant call of a crow, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the brush. I pulled off the main dirt road onto a narrower side trail. The side trail was steep, rocky, and overgrown, but it led to an old fire lookout tower that hadn't been used in years. I was supposed to inspect it because some hikers had reported strange noises and broken windows. I figured it might just be animals or wind, but I needed to check. The climb up the trail was tough. My boots slipped on loose gravel, and I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. The forest closed in tight on either side, thick with pine and fir trees that smelled like resin and cold earth. The trail was lined with broken branches and fallen leaves, some wet from the morning frost. When I got near the tower, I could see it leaning slightly, the wood dark and cracked. The windows were smashed, just like the report said. The door hung off its hinges. I shone my flashlight inside, but it was too dark to see much beyond the broken floorboards and scraps of old supplies left behind. I circled the tower, looking for signs of recent activity. There were footprints in the soft mud nearby. Boots, probably from hikers or maybe someone camping too close. I didn't like that. This place was dangerous. The tower could collapse at any moment, and the cliffs nearby made it even riskier. As I moved around the tower, I heard something else, faint, almost too soft to catch, a low scraping sound coming from the forest behind me. At first, I thought it was just a branch rubbing against another in the wind, but the forest was still. No breeze. The scraping kept going, slow and deliberate. I gripped my flashlight tighter and slowly turned toward the sound. The trees that were older, bigger, and closer together, casting heavy shadows. I could see nothing but dark trunks and fallen leaves. Then I spotted a flash of movement. Something was moving just beyond the tree line. My heart sped up, but I told myself to stay calm. It was probably a deer or a big bird. Maybe a bear. Bears were common here, especially in the fall when they were fattening up for winter. I called into my radio to let dispatch know where I was and what I was doing. No answer. The signal was weak out here. I always carried a satellite phone in my pack for emergencies, but it was in the truck parked half a mile down the road. I decided I needed to get back before dark. The sun was already sinking low behind the hills, and shadows were stretching long and deep. I didn't like the feeling of being alone here anymore. As I turned to leave, I heard the scraping again, this time closer. It was a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. I stopped, froze, and scanned the area with my flashlight. There was nothing in sight. Then I noticed the ground in front of me was disturbed. The dirt and leaves had been pushed aside in a long, narrow trail, heading deeper into the woods. Something big had dragged itself through here recently. I started back down the trail, trying to keep calm. I knew the forest was home to all kinds of animals, but this felt different. The trail was too fresh, and the sound too strange. About halfway back to the truck, the sun dipped below the ridge, and darkness fell fast. I pulled out my flashlight again and switched it on. The beam cut through the trees, lighting up the wet leaves and branches in front of me. Suddenly, I heard a sharp crack behind me. I spun around, shining the light toward the sound, but all I saw were the empty trees. The forest was quiet again, but my skin prickled. I felt like I was being watched. I picked up my pace, careful with each step on the uneven ground. Then the radio buzzed, a quick burst of static, and a faint voice I couldn't make out. The signal was breaking up. Closer to the truck now, I tried the satellite phone. No signal. I broke into a run, hearing twigs snap behind me with every step. My breath came out in harsh clouds in the cold air. Then, just as I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, I tripped over a root and fell hard on my hands. Pain shot through my wrist and knee. I gritted my teeth and scrambled up, looking back into the woods. There was a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible in the fading light. It wasn't moving, not even breathing, it seemed, just watching. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I jumped into my truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but the figure was gone. Driving back to the ranger station, I felt my hands shake on the wheel. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something chasing me. That night, I checked the maps and records for that part of the park. No reports of missing people or known dangers. No history of violence. Just old logging roads and abandoned structures. The next day, I went back with a colleague and some search dogs. We scoured the area around the tower and the side trail. We found fresh tracks, definitely human, but no one was there. The dragging trail led to a small cave hidden beneath a fallen tree. Inside, we found old camping gear, some empty cans, and signs someone had been living rough. No signs of violence, no blood, no bodies. The search dogs picked up a scent leading deeper into the woods, but after hours of searching, no one was found. We reported it, but the case was never solved. Sometimes I think about that figure watching me from the trees. Who it was, what wanted. Maybe it was someone trying to survive off the grid, hiding from the world. Or maybe it was something else, a desperate person who got lost or hurt and never made it out. What scared me the most wasn't the figure itself, but the fact that the forest can hide so much. The woods look calm and quiet, but beneath the surface, there's danger. Not the kind from ghosts or monsters, but the kind from nature and people. A wrong step, a bad choice, and you're in trouble. I learned to trust my instincts that day. When the forest feels off, it's not just your imagination. And sometimes the scariest things are the ones you can't explain, the ones hiding just out of sight. Now, every time I patrol that trail, I carry extra gear and I never go alone. The tower still stands, leaning and broken, a silent reminder that the forest keeps its secrets, and sometimes you're not the only one watching.